My dad would have never gone into the basement that night if he knew that I was watching him. "God, Danielle, you scared the crap out of me," he said. I knew that he didn't expect to see me because he tried not to swear when I could hear, but he did it twice. Also, he was dragging a heavy load in a white sheet that looked like it had blood on it. It was dark in the kitchen, but there was enough light coming through the open basement door to make it pretty unmistakable. "I woke up to get a glass of water," I explained. "What are you taking downstairs?" He looked down at the long, heavy object that was wrapped in the sheet. It's a new carpet." "For the basement?" "Yes. We don't have carpet in the basement, which is why we need this one. Go to bed, Danielle. It's a school night." I was pretty sure that he was lying about the carpet, like almost completely certain. Parents think they can get away with lying to their kids all the time, because they forget that growing means losing what we used to believe, and we're growing all the time. I tried very hard to listen to what was happening in the basement, but my bedroom was on the second floor and I couldn't hear a sound, which is much worse than knowing everything. I got home from school at 3:45 every day, and Dad never came back from work until after 6. I didn't want to check the basement alone, but we all do things that we don't want to do. Sometimes it feels like we don't have a choice, even when we're the ones acting. The basement is unpleasant. It's dark even when I pull the chain hanging from the ceiling to turn on the single bulb. We have to walk down the stairs with only the light from the kitchen. It's cold and it smells like bleach. I don't know why we have basements, which hold the stuff that we never use. Dad should have just thrown away the workbenches, the barrels, and the tools that he told me not to ask about. I'm not sure what I was looking for, but I hoped that I wouldn't find it. The concrete floor was clean, very clean, but the stains on the workbench had always been there. The basement still had no carpet. I bent down to search the floor. The coldness rose up from the ground and made me shiver as I got on my hands and knees, but the floor was spotless. If I was going to find anything, it had to be around hidden corners, and it had to be now. Daddy wouldn't be happy if he knew that I was in the basement, so I could only do this once. I pulled back a dirty sheet that was draped over a bench and I reached my hand into the darkness. I felt something. Dragging my hand out, I kept the objects covered, not wanting to know. And then I heard a car pulling into the driveway. Mom was home and time was up. So I scooped the objects and held them close. They were teeth. Grown-up teeth, because they had some silver parts like Daddy has. I felt ashamed when I looked at them. They reminded me of how far from normal I really was. I slid the teeth back behind the sheet and I ran into the kitchen before Mom got inside. Not knowing is worse than anything. Dad sat on my bed and kissed my forehead when I went to sleep, just like he always did. I was relaxed and safe when I felt his weight on the side of my mattress, but we all want our innocence broken, otherwise we would keep it forever. That's why I was hiding behind the sheet in the basement after he put me to sleep. I didn't want to be alone in the dark, and I didn't like knowing the teeth were on the ground next to me. But Daddy clearly didn't check that corner, so it was the safest place to hide. Staying quiet in a dark place is the best way to hear voices. Mom says that it isn't ghosts and that it's just our imagination going wild when all distractions are gone. But that just proves that she doesn't know what ghosts really are. My jeans and sweater didn't keep me warm. I couldn't stop shivering and I wanted to leave. But then the basement door opened and I really wanted to leave, but it was too late. Our desire is always the strongest in the moment that we realize something familiar has become out of reach. Step, thunk, step, thunk, step, thunk. Dad was dragging something heavy down the stairs. Click. I blinked as the light bulb shined dimly through the sheet. I assumed Daddy's eyes wouldn't be immediately adjusted, so I peeked into the room. He was kneeling over another sheet, wrapped bundle in the ground. This one was also bloody. He was sweaty and nervous as he unwrapped it. I had never seen a dead body before, but I knew right away that she wasn't alive. Her skin was the pale color of uncooked mushrooms, and her arms flopped like spaghetti instead of something alive. I wanted to look away so badly. I didn't look away though. Daddy pulled out the saw that spins around in a circle, and I knew that things were about to get gross. I was so disappointed in him. And then her arm moved. The woman's face was still dead, but I watched her fingers squirm like worms coming up from the ground after rain. Daddy didn't notice right away. Things might have been different if he had. He was examining the saw when her arm lifted high. It grabbed his throat like a snake that I had once watched eating a mouse. He dropped the saw and squeezed her hand until his fingers had turned white. But it didn't do any good. I felt like my entire body was in dried cement. I couldn't help him, and I couldn't turn away. I wanted to puke. Her arms came alive as Dad slapped her arm, his lips becoming blue while his tongue bulged. The blood vessels in his eyes changed to pink and then splotchy, and then the white turned red. He got weaker as the punches turned into gentle little slaps, and then he stopped moving. I squeaked. The woman dropped my dad to the floor, and he landed like spaghetti, and then she sat up, pulled the sheet off her body and turned around. She was completely naked and every part of her skin was pale. I wondered if ghosts are white because dead people sometimes have no blood in them. Our brains form weird thoughts during the most shocking moments. She stood, walked over to my hiding place and knelt down. I scooted back, convincing myself that I would be safe as long as I moved to the darkest corner. That works when we're hiding under the covers in our beds, so I decided it would do just as well here. It didn't work. She pulled back the sheet and stared at me as I stared right back. It may have been my very first time seeing a dead person, but I understood enough to know that she was still dead, no matter how much she was walking around. I stared back at eyes that couldn't blink. I breathed and she didn't. I wanted to run away, but I was cornered. I shook. "You feel alone," she said, but her voice was all wrong. "You're not alone. You never are." And then the woman reached out a rubbery hand and cupped my face. Her fingers were like ice, but I was afraid to fight back. It felt like my teeth were vomiting, but I couldn't stop them as my fangs cut through my gums and exposed themselves to the world. I hated it and I was ashamed, because they reminded me of how far from normal I really was. "Welcome to the night," she whispered as my first tears fell. "Now," she continued, looking behind her, "there are several options for your father. Are you ready to find out who you really are?" I stared at the naked woman who had just killed my father, unable to pin down my emotions, still very confused that she could talk to me despite being dead. "What do you mean about options for my father?" I breathed, feeling like I was watching myself from above. "My daddy's dead, right?" The woman folded her pale arms. I could see the veins just under her skin. Spider webbing throughout her body like blue tree roots wrapped in rice paper. "Dead doesn't mean what people think, Danielle." Her voice sounded sticky like mud as she narrowed her eyes at me. "If a person's soul can birth into this world where there had previously been nothing, don't you realize that it can go somewhere else when nothing returns?" "I don't know." I answered honestly. It felt like my voice was coming from underwater. Are you going to kill me now too? She reached out and lifted my lips. Her fingers were cold, not ice cold, but more like a dead fish that hasn't quite started to sink. You always knew what was hidden inside, didn't you? Even if you had never seen them, part of you knew what was there. I slid my tongue absently across the fangs that had erupted from my gums. The woman narrowed her cerulean eyes at me. We don't kill our own. And then she bared her teeth. Two poisonous-looking fangs dripped from her gums, curving into serpentine points. Come with me, Danielle. I will show you something different from what you've known, or what you thought was possible. I looked down at my father's crooked form. He hated bad posture, and it looked so wrong to see him so still, and my cheeks got hot as my head spun. And then the woman was holding my face close to hers. There's yet time for me to accept a turn. I'll do it, but only if you ask, Danielle. What do you want for your father? We don't grow up all at once. It happens in fits and starts, and never when we're ready. Age can only change us when our spirit is no longer fit for the world that we knew. I tried to turn away, but she wouldn't let me. Do what it takes to keep him here, I whispered. The woman stared at me harder, and it felt like she was scraping the back of my skull with her eyes. Death is natural. What you're about to see isn't. What has been done can never be undone. Do you understand? No, I answered, my head slumping. Oh, good. She let go of me. Anyone who answers yes to that question is insane. The woman turned around and paused while facing my dad, and then she slowly stepped toward him, her bare feet patting softly against the concrete floor. I felt guilty about the fact that there were only wrong choices before me. What are you going to do? I heaved, preparing to intervene. Oh, stop asking questions to which you already know the answers, Danielle. You're 12 years old. My stomach burned like it did the time that I ate too many deviled eggs that had been sitting in the sun. I fell to my knees. The dead woman knelt as well, hovering over my dad, her fangs extending even lower as they elongated past her bottom lip. Wait, I called out, but it was too late. We always like trying to stop things after it's too late, because that makes us feel like the world isn't what we make of it. Her fangs sunk deep into my daddy's neck with a splurge. The room felt like it was dancing from side to side as I held back the vomit. The dead woman pulled like she was sucking deeply from a straw. Her eyes rolled back as they bulged, turning into veiny orbs that protruded menacingly from her sunken white face. She rose up, lifting my dad's neck with her. His body shuddered, and then his skin turned a slightly darker tannish shade. Dad squeezed a fist, and then the woman released her mouth as Daddy fell to the ground and shook. Her eyes swiveled in their sockets before setting on me once more. She heaved, catching her breath while we stared at one another. He might rise, she gasped. He might not. Daddy's fist clenched again. But we can't wait to find out. She stood and stepped across my father's body, reaching her hand toward me. I didn't take it. Will things ever be normal again? Now that she had blood in her system, the woman seemed capable of emotion. I'm sorry, Danielle, but this was always going to happen to you. The only question was the timing. I looked past her knees. I want to see if Daddy wakes up. She bent down and took my hand by force. No, you don't. I wouldn't have believed that I was going to leave my father behind, but my legs seemed to carry me on their own accord. I followed the woman in a daze as we left the mess on our floor, and she led me up the 19 steps of my family's basement for the last time. "You'll be 13 soon," she explained as we walked out of the back door and into the chilly night. "Old enough to know the truth." She squeezed my hand tighter. I pulled back. "I want to go home," I protested. She turned sharply around to face me. "Danielle, where do you think I'm taking you?" Digging my heels into the grass, I tried to break free, but she was too strong, and it didn't matter how hard I clutched the ground. The woman floated up above me, legs hanging down as gravity released its hold on her. I wasn't ready to fly, but it was too late. She pulled my wrist after her, and my feet left the grass as my shoulders screamed in pain, the muscles stretching like taffy. As I rose into the air and flew past my childhood home into the night sky. The most shocking thing about flying was that it wasn't shocking at all. While the dead woman lifted above my backyard fence, pulling me behind her, the sensation felt natural. I watched as my shoes floated over the bushes as we floated into the night. I was afraid for my dad, and afraid of him. I didn't want him to be dead or undead or whatever the woman's bite had done to him. But every emotion climbed on top of itself as they screamed for my attention. They canceled themselves out, leaving me feeling completely numb as we all drifted. "Can't you fly any higher?" I asked her. I didn't want to look directly at the woman, because her naked and dead body had scared me. My hands were as cold as ice, far colder than any hand should be. "No," she responded. "I know you must have concerns, but you need to wait until we return to my congregation." Adults often answer questions by saying things that just raise more questions. Sometimes it's easier not to say anything in response and let a person feel like they're right. We floated through the night, and I felt like I was floating through it. The night became a physical presence, like water that I could drink or swim in. I was almost surprised when we stopped moving. We had landed in front of a large mansion with no lights on. We stood in thick, dewy grass that felt alive and dead at the same time. I thought about asking the woman if she was cold, but I suppose you don't care about a lot of things when you're dead. "Let's go, Danielle," she whispered. The woman pulled my hand, which was still resting in hers. "It's time for you to return home." A sudden jolt of fear ripped through my arm and stuck into my chest as I followed her forward. I didn't want to go in, but I couldn't think of any other option, so I obeyed. The house swallowed a noise. We walked up the front steps and through the door, and into a dark entryway with only the pale moon to guide us. Our footsteps made no sound as she led me around a hallway and to an open door. Light but no warmth radiated from the bottom of the staircase before us. Fear clutched my stomach and snaked up through my throat in the form of green nausea, as for the first time I tried to pull away. Her icy grip held firm. "You need to do this, Danielle," she ordered. The woman moved down the first step, pulling me unwillingly after. Each step felt worse. I knew that I didn't want to see what was at the bottom of the stairs, but I also knew that I didn't have a choice. I held my breath at the bottom before moving around the corner, telling myself that there was no way it could be as bad as I was setting it up in my mind. I was wrong. A ring of ghoulish-looking men and women huddled in a circle at the center of the stone-walled basement, each holding a flickering candle that made their pale skin look waxy. Several more candles sat throughout the room, providing the only source of light. Sitting in the middle of the group was a shirtless man kneeling on the floor, with his hands bound behind his back. His brown hair and beard splayed widely about his face. The man's head was bent forward, but he stared up with an angry defiance. Directly across from me, one pale man lifted his arms in greeting. "Welcome, Danielle, to Amenity Falls. I'm so glad that you're finally where you belong." My stomach lurched as I stared at him. His voice was somehow low and high at the same time, sliding a discomforting kind of fear up my spine. His most unsettling feature, however, was his eyes. They were pink. "I am Kadavru," he announced. "We've been waiting a long time to meet you, Danielle. More than anyone, Brooke here has been anticipating your encounter." The bound man grunted but did not budge. The woman finally released me and stepped toward the group. We both understood that I wouldn't run away. "You've done everything expected and more, Gita," Kadavru commended as one of the pale women placed a black robe around her, and then he turned to face me. "We're looking forward to great things, Danielle." I wanted to cry, puke, and hide, but I couldn't do any of those things. At least 19 pairs of eyes stared at me, and I knew that they could fly up the 13 steps before I got anywhere near the door. "Nothing to say," Kadavru pressed. "Very well. Your actions will do the speaking for you." The crowd drew back at his words, extending the circle to the stone edges of the basement. Only the kneeling man in the center remained in place. "Are you ready?" Kadavru hissed, smiling in a way that made me unhappy. "No," I finally announced to the room. "I don't know what's going on, and I think I want to go home." "You are home, Danielle," droned a pale woman from my right. "She's correct, child," Kadavru pressed, his inexplicably pink eyes boring into me. "You can't escape this." I wiped my eye. "I can't escape what?" I mumbled, not wanting to know the answer. Kadavru stared at me a moment longer before drawing a knife and approaching the kneeling man, Brooke, from behind. My breath stopped as he raised the knife and slashed. Brooke's arm burst forth as he leapt to his feet, the now severed rope falling to the floor. Kadavru backed away with a sinister smile. Brooke looked around wildly, like an animal trapped in a cage, at the people encircling him. I stepped back, pressing my arms against the cold stone wall. "Brooke is the reason that Gita ended up in your father's basement. He's also the reason that she will never see her daughter again." Brooke whipped around to stare at Kadavru, looking ready to murder him. "Danielle, the moment is right and the man is right. We're excited to share this with you." He grinned, lifting his arms. "Welcome to your first kill." We're prohibited from experiencing certain things at age 12. Kids hate that fact. But when the strange man told me that it was time for my first kill, I finally understood that grating phrase, "You're not old enough yet," can make a lot of sense. Brooke turned around and scowled at Kadavru. "This is why," he heaved. "This is exactly why you're filth. Every one of you," he spat, "is too cowardly to face me unless it's 20 to 1. And even then, you're afraid of me and send a little girl to do it." His breathing was very heavy. "You're nothing but trash, and I'll happily give my life to keep good people from being poisoned by trash. That's why the world is better off without her daughter," he finished with a whisper, pointing at Gita. In the frozen silence that followed, the only movement was the torchlight dancing on the man's bare, sweaty chest. And then Gita screamed and ran toward him, her robes flowing behind as she bared her vicious fangs. What happened next was so quick that I had to replay it in my mind 3 times before I understood what had happened. Brooke leaned toward her before quickly drawing back as Gita opened her mouth. He leapt into an uppercut that plowed directly into her now exposed neck. The punch was powerful enough to lift her off the ground. His gut kick was waiting as she landed. Gita collapsed to the floor, struggling to breathe. "You're a coward," Brooke yelled, pointing at Cadaveru. He took several bold steps through the middle of the circle, closing the gap between them. "And if I'm going to die here, it's going to be fighting against Bah!" Cadaveru grabbed Brooke by his neck and lifted the muscular man with a single arm. Brooke kicked frantically, but his boots were 2 feet off the ground. Cadaveru inspected him with a curious look, as though he were holding a particularly interesting coin up to the light. "I have no particular need for the 2 of us to spar," he explained in a calm voice. "You would already be dead otherwise." He dropped Brooke to the ground with a sound like 10 melons falling at once. Brooke struggled to pull in air while failing to draw himself into a kneeling position. Nearby, Gita was on her hands and knees, staring in hate as she slowly regained her breath. A chill ran through me as I looked across at Cadaveru, who stood over the group without any hint of emotion or movement. "You're wasting your time in fighting the inevitable, Hunter," he explained in the same deep and controlled voice. "You can resist what's foregone, or you can do what you've come here to do." Brooke rolled his head to face his enemy, and then Cadaveru pulled something from inside his robes and dropped it to the stone floor with a clatter. 1 wooden stake, 19.13 inches, carved to your exact specifications, he explained. "You can have it if you face the task for which you have been brought here." Electric chills flared in my hips, buzzing on my neck and back, before curling around my ears and settling in my head, as every face turned toward me. I snapped around to check the staircase, but 3 pale, robed figures moved to block it, and then I looked again to Brooke. He met my eyes, and it was enough to know that he hated me before he knew me. "Fine," he announced, reaching for the stake without breaking his gaze. "If you're vile enough to want me to murder your children, that's where I'll start." I wanted to cry. I wanted to explain that I wasn't one of them, that everyone clearly hated me equally, that it wasn't fair to pull me into a world filled with purposeless anger, where I had nothing to gain from winning a fight. But I understood the truth as Brooke rose to his feet, continuing to glare at me with hatred that I had no hope of understanding. Angry people cannot win fights by hardy people they oppose. Their only concept of victory is to destroy the faith of those who believe that conflicts can be resolved without pain. "Please stop," I squeaked as the robed figures parted to give Brooke access to me. He looked down on me with joy. My breath hitched as I realized that he could choose to stop himself, but he simply wouldn't do so as long as he was alive. He raised the stake as he stepped in front of me. We all have pieces of ourselves that float around unused, like books high atop forgotten shelves, until the strangest turn of fate makes us pull them out and see what's inside. I felt another piece of me, a hidden Danielle, squirming to get free. Brooke reached for me with his left hand as he lifted his right one higher, and something snapped, and the inner Danielle jumped into my skin. My fangs erupted as I jumped at Brooke, suddenly confident and very angry as I focused on the hand coming toward me. I took it into my mouth and bit down in red fury, the hand bones snapping like little twigs as my teeth sunk deep into his meat. He flinched like a jolt of electricity had shot through him. The stake momentarily stopped. Now hurt, Brooke swung it again as I pulled deeply at the flavorful blood in his hand. He froze. I pulled again, drinking the essence of his life, and He dropped the steak to the ground as his eyes sunk into their sockets. I drank it again and his skin melted against his bones, his face not little more than a fleshy skull. Pulling one more time, I watched his skin turn ashen gray as his lips disappeared. His neck, now little more than deflated flesh, was unable to support a head that rolled back like rotten fruit. I released his hand and pulled my head back while pushing against his frail frame. Now little more than a skeleton, I tossed the body lightly aside. It crashed to the floor with a weak clatter, the sound of tinkling teeth scattering to the edges of the dark room. I felt good. I felt alive. 19 sets of eyes gazed at me, but no one said a word. It was Kadavru who finally broke the silence, but he remained pressed against the wall as he spoke. "Little girl," he gasped, "what kind of monster are you?" Our sense of right and wrong is mostly determined by the passions of those who happen to be standing nearby. So as I gazed at the 19 sets of menacing eyes while I backed into a stone wall, I truly felt that I was the one in the wrong, even though I didn't understand why. "Why did you bring her here, Kadavru?" one of them asked in a terrified voice. "She doesn't belong with us." I didn't want them to see me cry. "She's crying," another called out. "She knows that she's a freak." "I don't," I whispered. "You're the ones who brought me." I pressed my back against the cold rock of the basement wall, trying to grab onto anything but coming up empty-handed. The crowd formed a semicircle around me so that I couldn't see them all at once, no matter how quickly I glanced in every direction. Their ghost-like faces were even more sinister in the dancing torchlight. "We're not safe with her around," another announced. A sob escaped my lips despite my best efforts to hold it back. I was the only one to be attacked. "She doesn't understand," a man's deep voice called out. "We can't explain it to someone who doesn't already believe us." And Gita had recovered from her attack and gotten to her feet, enjoying the crowd. She stepped to the middle of the semicircle and plucked something from the ground. It was the wooden stake that Grupe had used to attack me. "It sometimes can be difficult to do the right thing," she breathed, her knuckles flexing around the weapon. "But we need to keep our community safe." I nearly fell over as the images of the night flew through my mind. Gita's limp, alabaster body on my basement floor. Grupe dissolved into dust by my actions. My father somewhere between alive and dead, left behind as I was whisked away. "I didn't want any of this," I whimpered. "I'm only 12. "That just proves how dangerous she is," another man called out. Something broke inside of my mind just then. I had always believed that right and wrong were clear lines that any level-headed person could see if they chose to do so. In that moment, however, I realized that we all choose to imagine the boundary with whatever hindsight makes us most comfortable, and we see violence as a way of correcting the existence of those who prove that morality is retroactive. And I remembered that I had teeth. I looked up at Gita's twisted sneer as she gazed at me in unmitigated disgust. I felt her hate and I reflected it back. I had never learned how to pull my fangs out, but instinct guided me as I dropped them down and hissed. She let go of her stake and staggered back. Adrenaline flowed through me as I realized that I didn't have to hate myself as much as they hated me. I might even be able to run out of the basement if I could just get past the crowd. Turning to the steps leading out of this place, I gauged the strength of those who stood in my way. They all scurried aside before I could form another thought. They were afraid of me. I loved and hated myself for understanding this fact. That paradox mixed with the decision that I didn't want to make, but had to act on immediately. Racing up the stairs could save myself, but it would also require embracing the ugliness of believing that I was at my best when feeling like a living pestilence. The alternative was to let them hurt me, which has a hypnotic appeal when you're made to feel that our spirits are intrinsically disgusting. All of this was felt with emotions and no words. It would take years to articulate even to myself what I had experienced in that moment. I hated myself and I ran. Up the stairs, into the hall and out the front door and into the night. The frigid air wrapped me tight and I had undressed for the occasion, and I was cold. I didn't understand what had happened, but I knew that I was alone. With no cell phone and no idea where I was, I wandered. I lost a lot of things that night, some all at once and others bit by bit as I traversed an unfamiliar city. I had always believed that life had strict boundaries and that certain lines could never be crossed. One of those false convictions was that somebody would always take care of me. But passing street after street in the unforgiving chill, it stripped that away. I cried. I was at the intersection of 19th and 13th when I decided that anyone who really cared about me would have been by my side while I was alone. And then I turned to the left and saw myself reflected in a store window. For the first time in hours, I smiled. It revealed two tiny things when I took the time to look hard enough. The sun was almost ready to peek over the gray sky morning when I finally recognized the street that I had been walking. Without thinking, I headed towards home. Every contradicting emotion ran through me at once. Above them all was a single thought. I had left my father behind on the floor. Shouldn't he treat me the same way? Anxiety swirled with adrenaline to curdle into nausea that settled deep in my stomach as I placed my hand on the back doorknob. I had last seen my father dead on the ground. Maybe. So much of this night had been driven by the fact that I had to make decisions about my life without understanding what was happening or why. I closed my eyes and reminded myself that one day I would be an adult, and I would never have to feel that way again. I opened the door and walked into the house. It was very still, like the place had been abandoned. Nervousness flowed through me as I stepped toward the basement door. It stood slightly ajar. Had we left it open, I couldn't remember. My hands were shaking as I reached out and opened it. The basement was quiet. Nausea grew with each step. Did I want to see my father's body? Or was I hoping to see him alive, even though he would be in a certain agony? I didn't know what to hope. I took the last step into the basement, and then I turned a corner, looked down at the blood-stained floor, and gasped. Imagine how a body looks when a victim dies in pain. Can you see the fear in their glazed eyes? The way their mouth is frozen in a wide-open, permanent scream as rigor mortis sets in. Their gnarled fingers forever locked in the last failed attempt to end their pain. Now imagine that person as someone that you loved. My father was still recognizable, but his body was far enough removed from normal that everything in the world felt off-kilter. It would have been better if he were marred beyond recognition, but the semi-familiarity made it so much worse, like I was listening to soothing and familiar music played out of tune in the wrong key. Daddy's eyes stared up at me from the basement floor. I remember staring at his skin and thinking that it was the color of paper, far beyond the hue of any normal tone. The look on his body's face was clear. He could see the end coming and he wanted to reach for it. All of the aspirations for the second half of his life were worth destroying if it meant stopping the pain. I couldn't put all of this into words when I was 12. The emotions were specific but beyond my ability to articulate. I can share them now because I've relived those moments daily in the years since, and I had to put the voice to the feelings if I wanted to keep my sanity. The image of my dead father broke something in my mind. Watching his corpse stand up sent that fissure into the deepest part of me, cracking my spirit and leaving it unfixable. "What happened, Danielle?" he whispered. His voice sounded like dust blowing over rice paper. "What did I lose?" I wanted to help him stand, but I was afraid of my corpse dad. So I tried as he slowly and feebly got to his feet, grasping the handrail for support as he looked around the basement with wide eyes. My throat was nearly too dry to speak. "You died, Daddy." He looked down at me, not in confusion or in anger, but sadness. He stepped forward like Frankenstein's monster, and I recoiled in fear. He saw that he was scaring me, but he didn't know how to stop it. So we just stared at each other ashamed. "You didn't tell me the truth," I whispered. "Are you really my dad?" He was quiet for a long while. The tears forming at the edges of his eyes marked the first time that I had ever seen him cry. "I wasn't your dad when you were born, Danielle. I'm only your dad now if you let me." I didn't know what to say. "What am I?" He swayed on his feet. "Something I was taught all my life that I needed to hate." I nodded. It made sense because it was the opposite of everything that I had ever known, which is exactly how this entire night had been. "My family is composed of hunters, and we've always hated vamps because they killed so many of the people that we loved. Our only response was to eradicate them." "Is that how they saw you?" My voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "I suppose I never really thought about it." He wobbled again. My dad's face was still paper white. "Your mom and I had a little girl before you were born. The vamps got to her at her first birthday party, January 9th, 13 years ago. It changed the way that I understand sadness, Danielle. Everything bad that had happened to me before losing my first daughter, pain as a concept had always been sadness that arose from hoping things might return to normal. But losing a child meant accepting that life simply can't be normal again. Ever. Pain doesn't work the same way afterward, because hope is dead." He wiped his eyes again. I noticed that they were turning pink. So I made a decision. We didn't speak for at least a minute. I could feel the quiet hanging thick between us, like heavy swamp moss that dangled in clumps from when Dad took us on a trip to Louisiana when I was 10. It was hard to breathe there too. I took a little girl from one of them. Figured that killing her was too easy. No, I was going to do worse, so much worse. I would raise her to be like me, to hunt them without mercy. When they saw one of their own turned, I knew they would finally be broken like I was. My insides felt like concrete. Dad cried harder. Two things happened. The first is that I discovered that the little girl wasn't a vamp like the rest of them. She didn't feed the same way, didn't have the same hunger. The congregation would hate her even more than our hunters, because she was an abomination in their eyes. The second is that the broken piece of me, the one that had stopped hoping, had shifted again. It didn't reset to the way things had once been. That's impossible. But the hate that had been burning for so long, that had kept me going forward. It wasn't satisfied, but just sort of ran out of fuel. I became a less efficient hunter, so I didn't fight as much. As a result, I wasn't with the rest of my gathering on the night that they were ambushed. I was taking care of my little girl while her mom was away. I think the other hunters chose that night because I would be gone, since I was losing my edge. Good thing I never told them my plan to raise a vamp, because they had solved the problem in their own way. He sighed. It was a hollow, ringing sound, like wind rushing through an abandoned home. When 4 of them died in a single night, I withdrew. I didn't hunt at all for a while, and I realized that I didn't miss it. Didn't miss the fire that had been burning me every day. I knew the truth had to come out eventually. and I knew that Vamp and Hunter alike would see my daughter as a target when that day came. But she was the best thing in my world, so I decided to live the best life we could with the time that we had left. He stopped talking and he looked at me. I stared right back. "So," he asked, his voice nearly caught in a sob, "what do we do now?" I stared at my father, neither alive nor dead, watching him sway on his feet. Our minds go to strange places in the most intense moments of our lives. I remember how drafty the basement was. I was tired but didn't want to sleep. A paint stain on the ground consumed my attention as I thought about the fact that it had always been there, but I had never taken the time to consider how it had come to be. "Danielle," Dad whispered. I looked up at his paper-white skin, marred only by 2 puncture marks in his neck where livid red blood sparkled beneath these sodium lights. I remembered a line from a play that my teacher had tried to explain to us. Too early seen unknown and known too late. After asking the class what it meant, and then receiving no response, she just looked sad and put her big red book away. She never mentioned it again. I think a lot of adults are like that. They want to share something very personal and special, but they spend their lives in silence, waiting for somebody to ask in just the right way. I don't know why I thought of that line, but it made sense for just a few seconds. "Danielle," he breathed again. "Do you hate me?" I didn't know what to say, and I know that my silence hurt him. He was just starting to cry when the window broke. Dad ran forward and yanked me away from the steps as we heard the upstairs window slide open. "Danielle," he hissed, "don't make a sound." Footsteps paced across the floor directly above our heads as a man stalked deliberately toward the basement door. I held my breath as I realized that there was no place to run or to hide. The basement was a dead end. Dad squeezed my shoulders with ice-cold hands. Slowly, the door at the top of the stairs opened. "Hello, Danielle," a gravelly voice called, and then he started walking down the steps. Dad pulled me back toward the far wall, moving himself in front of me as we watched a shadow emerge. It was a tall man with long, flowing brown hair. His teeth were very white when he smiled. He seemed like the sort of person who was happiest when he was angry. "True," Dad announced in a shaky voice. "It's been some time." True cocked his head at my father. "Yes, and now that we've caught up, we need to talk about Danielle." Dad's entire body froze. "How did you know?" Our connection at the congregation felt that this was worth sharing. True answered dismissively. He flexed his fists, making the muscles in his chest look like they were about to tear through his tight black shirt. "You're far, far beyond sloppy at this point. Your failure endangers the rest of the gathering." He pulled out a long, thin, and wooden spike. "I came as quick as I could. You raised her as a human daughter. You shouldn't have to be the one to do it." Every skin cell felt like it was being burnt off my body. Until that night, I would have never thought my daddy was capable of killing anyone, let alone me. But as I looked back on what both of us had done in the past few hours, I realized that we're all strangers to each other, because we were all strangers to ourselves. "Essen," he pressed, addressing my father by name for the first time. "You shouldn't have to be the one to do it." True walked towards us, and then my dad stepped to the side, exposing me to the man who looked so happy to be so hateful. My head spun like a top. I didn't move because I had been so sure that my dad would protect me, because dads are supposed to keep their daughters safe. And I was so shaken by the abandonment that I couldn't think of a single way to react other than freezing in place and waiting for him to hurt me. True's grip was like a metal clamp. I tried to move only when it was too late. His smile grew wider as he felt me struggle. Helplessness leads to panic and leads to helplessness, and the cycle is quick. I smacked his hand as hard as I could, but that just brought him more joy. Do you know why our stakes are exactly 19.13 inches? It's a very important number. He asked, holding the pointed stick up to my face. I cried. His grip snapped away quickly as his hands grabbed a throat that had just split like the doughy skin of a dumpling. I was confused at first because I had never seen somebody's neck eaten while they were still alive, and I didn't know that my father had fangs. True fought back long after his body was no longer worth saving. Dad drank his blood like a thirsty athlete, gulping it down in disgusting swigs. And then he opened his mouth and released True, who bounced on the floor like a rag doll. Dad grabbed the wooden stake from the ground and plunged it into True's heart with a squelch. He gasped for breath. I stared down numb. Dad? I whispered. Did I just grow up? He looked up at me in shame, his hollow, ice-blue eyes animalistic. Are you sad? I tried to swallow, but my throat was too dry. Sad and confused. He nodded. The answer's yes, just a little bit. We waited in silence. We're not safe here, are we? I finally asked. We're not safe anywhere, Danielle. He wiped the blood from his mouth and tears from his eyes. I will be sorry for the rest of my life, he stood. The blood dripped from his chin. So, he asked, his voice wary, do you want to know the truth? The air felt heavy in my lungs, like everything around me was grittier and always would be. No, I answered. I don't want to know the truth. I wiped my eyes, but I have to now. Dad stepped toward me and wrapped me in a soft hug. It was the gentlest touch that I had felt from him since that horrible night began. He kissed the top of my head and pulled me in close. I hugged him back, but there was a great distance between us that I incoherently believed was temporary. Growing up usually isn't fun, Dad said as he released me. I suppose that's why parents hide it from their children for as long as they can. I stared around at the stark basement, the bright lights and the blood on the ground. Will we have to run away? I asked. My voice sounded like it was coming from another room. Dad wiped his eye. Yeah, he folded his arms. And I don't think I'll be able to go with you. My stomach turned cold. Like every organ had changed to stone at that exact same time. Dad looked at me but didn't face me. I achieved my first kill at 19, because I had been planning for it since I was 13. Danielle, when you believe in a cause, it has a way of becoming its own justification, even when that cause works against the things that led you to it in the first place. He shuffled his feet around at True's spreading blood. Our gathering, that's the name for a group of vamp hunters, made a deal with a very dangerous man. He gave us information and money to help us hunt. It was never enough to give us what we wanted, but always just sufficient to get him what he needed. We took it because we believed that we were right. He wiped his other eye. I convinced myself that he wasn't doing the exact same thing for the congregation. That's a group of vamps that we were hunting. I had to make myself think that, because I knew the truth would destroy my belief system, and I'd already hurt too many people to question whether I was wrong. He squatted next to True and rested his hand on the man's bloody brown hair. Why was the dangerous man giving you money if he was tricking you? Dad smiled, and I had never seen him look so sad. That's the best way to control someone, Danielle. I didn't understand. Who is he? Dad slowly turned to face me. Alistair Delora. Remember his name, Danielle, because he already knows yours. A finger of hot nausea tickled the back of my throat. Why would he care about knowing the little girl's name? Dad's lips drew thin as he stood. It doesn't matter that you're a little girl. If you have something that he wants, then you're just an obstacle. He ran his fingers through thinning hair. I always knew that, I always saw it, but I chose to pretend that I didn't. People who make those mistakes are rarely the ones to pay for them. I'm so sorry, Danielle. So, let me get this straight. I shot back, my eyes suddenly molten hot. The hunters want to hurt me because they think I'm a vamp. The vamps want to hurt me because they think that I'm not. And the dangerous man is coming for me because I'm in the middle. The heat spread across my face. I felt like I was melting from the inside out, and that everybody would be happier if I dissolved into nothing. In that moment, I was sure that the world wouldn't be at peace until I decided to stop loving myself. Dad turned paler. He handed me the bloody steak, which I took in shaking hands. I didn't want it, but I was sure that I had no choice. What will the bad man do if he finds me? Dad turned away. I don't know. I made a decision to remain ignorant. He folded his arms. There are more special people all over the world. The man is very interested in special women and girls. He swallowed. The hair on my neck stood at attention as I felt fingers curl around my ankle. I looked down to see that True was not quite dead. The stake was in his heart before I realized that I was bending over to attack him. I noticed that my fingers were coated in blood and that the wooden tip had disappeared into his chest, and that the grip on my ankle had slackened. Attacking him didn't feel unnatural. I decided that the world might be right. Perhaps it wouldn't be happy until I no longer loved myself, but I didn't owe happiness to the world. If taking as much for myself meant misery for others, then they deserved the rottenness that they wanted to spread. I lacked the ability to articulate any of this at age 12, but I understood it was true without the phrasing being necessary. Most people are afraid of arranging exact words in a perfect order, because we can only endure our own minds when shrouded in at least a little bit of mystery. I stood. What does he do with these special women and girls? I breathed, distantly shocked at how steady my own voice sounded. Dad got paler. They're brought to a place called the Harlequin Heaven. No one taken there ever leaves. That's all I know. I rubbed my fingers around the slick blood coating my fingertips. When are they coming for me? The sound of a car racing down the street swept into the basement, loud enough for us to feel the urgency in the driver's effort. Danielle, Dad snapped, grabbing my wrist. We have to run. I sprinted up the basement stairs without waiting for an explanation from my father. So many different people wanted to hurt me that it was safer to assume every stranger was an enemy. The van screeched to a halt just outside of our front door. The sound was loud enough to communicate exactly what was unfolding, even though I couldn't see it. A heavy man leapt onto the sidewalk and raced toward the house. And the only way out of the basement was moving upward and closer to the front door. Have you ever been forced to run from danger by running toward it? Our survival instinct stretches and cracks in those moments, pushed and pulled by contradictory messages between our higher and lower brains. But I knew that moving too slowly would be a final mistake, so I sprinted to the top of the stairs and pushed open the door. A thin, pale man was waiting for me. Danielle, he whispered as the man outside slammed against the front door. Please, I gasped. Please move. There's a man who wants to hurt me. There are many men who want to hurt you, he answered in a steady voice. The front door slammed again as the thin man reached for me. Dad shoved me hard against the wall and tackled the pale man as the front door burst open. The two of them rolled on the floor, each bearing a vicious-looking set of fangs. They stopped with Dad on the bottom, his enemy's hands wrapped around his neck. What did you think those teeth would do, SN? The pale man smiled as he stepped behind him. You can't hurt me with a bite, but I can make you suffer by squeezing a throat that will never die. He hissed as he grabbed Dad's neck even tighter, his face turning bright red. Dad made silent eye contact with me as the pale man continued talking. You can't see more than one step ahead, SN, and that's why your daughter won't. Dad burst forward and knocked the pale man onto the stake that I had pointed against his back. The weapon ripped through his chest with a splurge that seemed to surprise him more than anything else. Blood gushing down his chest. The pale man looked back at me in confusion before rolling off my father. Dad gasped for breath as the other man walked into the kitchen. He seemed 9 feet tall and bearded and thick, more animal than human. My survival instinct kicked into high gear. I knew that he was here to take me to the man that Dad had warned me about, and that I would have been safer if we had just let the vamp kill me. Understanding hit me in an instant. Both a hunter and a vamp had appeared minutes apart from each other and alone. Such an arrangement meant that they wouldn't fight one another, and they wouldn't have the numbers to take me. But it would be just enough to slow us down so that this towering behemoth could have his way in the end. They had been sacrificed by a man who knew how to use his pawns. Time ticked sideways. I looked down from the stranger to my father, and I understood what was about to happen. I knew that he would overpower the two of us even with our fangs, and that this fight was over before it began. "I know what's in room 1913, SN," the large man said. Dad closed his eyes and took a long breath before looking at me. For a few moments, every sound ceased except for my father's voice. He stared up from the floor, eyes bloodshot and face still red, too exhausted to cry. "Danielle, if you've ever loved me, don't stop running." He sprang to his feet and lunged at the enormous man. Dad's face met a plate-sized fist that knocked him to his knees. Dad couldn't win this fight, but if he fought to the end, it would be enough to give me a 30-second head start. "Would you run away?" I thought that I would need a long time to consider, but it turns out that we really know the answers to even the most painful questions. It just takes time to admit them. I turned and sprinted toward the back door, bursting through it as Dad screamed. I ran until my lungs burned and my veins pumped battery acid, and I didn't stop for a very long time. I knew that the world could hurt me because I could hurt it right back, and I could look at that fact from any angle that I chose. I never saw my father again. I knew it even then, but wouldn't believe it for a long time. The large man, however, would reappear several times in my life. I was a freak, but everybody's a freak from someone else's perspective, and feeling normal is just a lack of self-awareness. Tears flowed freely as I raced into the night. This was Dad's fault. All parents fail their children in ways that will follow them forever. I suppose that's the only reason we can beg forgiveness from our own children. My ugliness kept me alive by hurting anyone who felt normal through hating me, and each encounter pulled back more of the veil. I figured it didn't make much sense to hate myself, and so many other people were handling that particular task. So I felt the difference flow through me as I lifted my legs higher and higher, moving away from everyone who believed that I was wrong from birth, and reached. Soon my feet weren't even touching the ground, and I stopped pumping them altogether as I floated higher and higher into the night. "You have to admit," Dan said as the drone hovered over our deck and lowered its box full of supplies with surprising care, "there's something kind of funny about them." "Yup," I said with very little enthusiasm. "Normally we can't get corporate to buy us coffee," he said, "but now we've got a Congo line of flying Roombas bringing us our food. I feel like royalty," I replied in a flat monotone, barely listening to my own words. "Oh, come on," Dan cried. "I know this sucks, but it'll be okay. We've got supplies. There's a rig just 10 miles away. We can walk to them if we need to. This isn't the 1800s. We're not going to go mad from lead poisoning in our PJs. We just need to hold out." I don't know if he meant it, but Dan's choice of words had a sobering effect on me as I stood beside him on deck. hold out. I wonder if he realized how tough the next few months would actually be. I was about to say something when I was distracted by the drone. Quietly, it lifted itself from the deck, wobbled gently in the Arctic wind, and then flew off at a deceptively high speed. It was the last one that corporate would send for at least a month, and before it had even left my sight, I found myself missing the quiet reminder of civilization. "It's just a bit of bad luck," I said. "First the engines and then Gabe." "Yeah, you could say that again," Dan replied. "Besides, you know that Gabe would have found this whole situation hilarious. He really left us up the creek and without a paddle. Wherever he is, he's laughing his butt off." I knew at some point that I would have to come to terms with the loss of our chief engineer, but for now I was still cursing his stubbornness. If he had just let one of the other mechanics take care of the engine alert instead of telling them to go back to sleep when he had sorted it, the ship would have never gotten stuck. It wasn't like he had planned on having a heart attack halfway down to the engine, leaving things to go from bad to worse as the ship froze in place. That was just plain unlucky, but it was bad luck that would cost us 4 months of waiting around for spring. "Any news of the others?" Dan asked. I walked over to the railing and stared down at the jagged shoreline around our hull. Blocks the size of small trucks lay angled haphazardly against it, their sharp edges threatening all kinds of damage. It was going to be a heck of a job of making sure everything down there stayed intact over the next few months. Our ship was big, but the weather was bigger. "They're facing a tough fight too, the rig, given the weather," I said, "but nothing that they can't handle. From there, it'll either be a chopper or sled dogs, depending on how generous corporate is feeling. Either way, they'll be home for Christmas. Us, on the other hand." There was a moment of silence, the first that we had in days since the evacuation got underway. Now, with the last of the drones gone, and our crew having disappeared over the horizon, there was no ignoring the full weight of our isolation. "Any radio contact off them?" Dan asked. "I'm sure they're fine. It's only been about 6 hours since they had left," I said. "But if you're worried, why don't you try and raise them anyway? The weather will make it hard, but not impossible." Dan gave this some thought before agreeing. "That can't hurt," he shrugged. "That storm is getting serious, though. Don't stay out here too long feeling sorry for yourself." He patted me on the back before making for the nearest door. He was right about the storm. The wind out on deck was making short work of my cold weather gear, and already a fine layer of frost had started to form on my lashes and eyebrows. But I decided to stand outside for a few minutes more as I came to terms with the catastrophe that had left me stranded in the Arctic during winter. At the very least, I figured I should get used to being alone. It was a little galling, to be honest, standing out there facing the enormity of the Arctic climate. A tiny man stood on a colossal ship that itself was trapped in the ice like a bug in amber, deafened by the wind. I turned and surveyed our little metal fortress, and found myself wishing that I could have joined the others in the evacuation. But the ship was my responsibility, and there was nowhere else for me to go. I decided that before I went back in, I should grab the last of these supply packages. Carefully, I fumbled across the icy deck, looking for the small yellow crate. I found it half tipped over and buried in a growing pile of snow that threatened to hide it entirely. It was only a small box, just big enough to fit a decent supply of potentially life-saving medication, and I stopped down to pick it up with both hands before noticing that it wasn't alone. Another package was on top of it, no bigger than a ring box. Without thinking, I grabbed it, stuffed it in my pocket, and I hurried back indoors. I didn't feel much better once inside, despite the warmth and the light. There was something awfully lonely about the way the metal corridor beckoned ahead of me in eerie silence. The ship was normally a hive of activity, but now it felt derelict and faintly sinister. And with near hurricane winds just beyond the metal walls, there was the claustrophobic sensation of being trapped in a cavern deep beneath the earth, a constant reminder of the enormous forces pressing down on you, threatening to crush you. I stripped out of my coat and shook it free of melting ice water before reaching into the pocket and removing the tiny package. The drone could only bring a single item, so where did this second one come from? I wondered. Holding it up to the light, I saw that it was a rough-looking thing. A tiny box made of poorly cut wood, wrapped in ragged fabric and tied together with a peculiar waxy string. It came undone easily enough, revealing some old hay and a tiny thumb-sized piece of coal. Oh, that's just the weirdest frickin' thumping. The sound came from behind me, a hard object striking the door that I had been leaning against. I cried out and leapt away, instinctively reaching out to open the door under the assumption that somebody was stuck outside. But something made me hesitate at the last moment. I couldn't say what, just a vague sense that the fist that had hammered against the door was not pleading for help. And who on earth could be out there? Everyone is inside. I turned back and I looked down the corridor. It was uncomfortably dark. What few lights lined the walls were flickering and weak. "Dan," I cried, hoping that he would appear, but nothing responded to my voice. I cranked the door open by an inch, peered into the furious white gloom that lay outside, and I slammed it shut before any more of the cold could get inside. There was nothing out there, obviously. Any noise must have been made by something loose getting thrown around, or perhaps the metal shrinking as the temperatures had dropped. Just the wind, I muttered to myself while thumbing the piece of coal that I had unconsciously put in my pocket. Nothing to be worried. "Mike?" The radio went off on my belt and I dang near jumped out of my skin. For a second I actually thought of running, although God knows where that would be, before I got the better of my nerves and I calmed myself down. "Dan," I said into the radio, hoping to heck that I didn't sound half as scared as I was. "What's going on?" "You haven't been mucking around in the freezer, have you?" he asked, and even over the radio I could tell that he was deeply unsettled. "God, no," I said. "Until we could get a chopper out to us, that was where poor Gabe's body was being stored." "Why?" "It's Gabe," he said. "He's gone. His body, it's just gone." We found him just as night began to fall and the storm had really picked up. I had spent the last few hours searching the lower deck, relying on the tiny disk of light emitted by my torch to sweep each room in the hope of finding Gabe's body. The entire time my imagination was in overdrive, and it conceived 1,000 horrible ways that I might find him. But the worst by far was the idea of opening some dark room deep in the bowels of the ship and glimpsing his upright body standing in the corner, lit starkly by my feeble light. It was a ridiculous idea, an intrusive thought that had lodged in my mind. But just like a splinter, I found it hard to leave alone. My mind kept toying with this idea, unable to skip past the awful image of his pallid face turning to face me in the eerie silent dark. "Mike, you're gonna want to see this." Dan's voice blurted from my radio, and I jumped a mile at the intrusion. I had only just pushed open the door to some random cupboard when the sound had came and burst the tension that had gripped me. After a brief second spent catching my breath and trying to smooth any anxiety out of my voice, I replied, "What's going on?" "We found him," he said. "One of the engineers checked out the port that opens directly under the ice. He wanted to take a look at the staging areas that the evacuees had used." "And?" I asked. Just get down here. This is something else." I made it to the port in question a few minutes later, It was situated below deck, close to the very bottom of the ship. It was already open, but standing inside by the doorway were several engineers who looked at me but seemed unable to speak. "What the heck is going on?" I asked when I noticed that one of them had been sick on the ice just outside. "Up there," one of them said while pointing upwards. Just see for yourself." I stumbled out onto the ice, bracing myself for the cold, and I found Dan with his jaw hanging open and his eyes wide, fixed on the hull of the ship somewhere above my head. "Dan, what the heck is?" The words froze in my throat as I turned and saw what had left everybody else so shaken. Gabe's naked body had been flash frozen to the side of the hull, about 30 meters up. His back pressed firmly against the steel until ice had formed, and it kept him there hanging freely. His legs, arms, and head were left to dangle loosely under their own weight, giving him the forlorn look of a disappointed child. And his head was so low that it appeared to be staring right at us. And yet I couldn't see anything of his actual expression. The lights on deck were directly overhead and cast his face in harsh shadows. For a moment I was stunned into silence. Part of me was disgusted, another horrified, and another part of me entirely was quietly thinking about the mechanics of lowering a body over the side and then pressing it against the metal so firmly that it froze so completely that it could be left there under its own weight. In the end, the paralysis faded, and I managed to turn to Dan and say, "We'll have to get him down once the storm passes." It had been a long night, one that I had spent locked in my room with the wardrobe piled up against the door for extra security. Even then, I barely slept, and able to stop myself thinking of Gabe's body that, through some dark twist of fate, lay only a few meters on the other side of my bedroom wall. And when my mind wasn't focused on this, I kept wondering who amongst our crew was capable of such a messed up thing. This lack of sleep left me groggy and disgruntled, as I stood out on deck, pleased to at least see that the storm had cleared for a while, and had the engineers rig me up to go over the side. I'd be riding a cleaning platform the entire time, but I was also to be equipped with a harness that attached both to the winch and the ship's gunwale as a backup. With any luck, if the winch had failed, I would get knocked around a little, but I wouldn't be sent plummeting to my death. When it came time to mount the platform, I did so with an outward confidence born from years of experience, but on the inside, I was like a kid with stage fright. It took everything that I had to not rip the harness off of me and go running back to my room, but I had a job to do, and it was one heck of a job. Going over the side and securing Gabe before the engineers applied torches to the other side of the hull to thaw him off of the metal. But as the guy in charge, it was my job. Still, I couldn't stop myself from jumping a little when the motor had started up, and for a moment it felt like the floor was going to fall out from under my feet. As I descended, I caught Dan's eyes and realized that he was every bit as terrified as I was. Neither of us were that bothered with heights, of course. Sure, something could go wrong, but we spent our lives running an icebreaker between oil rigs in the Arctic. It was dangerous work. No, it was the thought of what waited for me partway down. After a minute or two, I saw a lump against the ship's hull appear below my feet. Gingerly, I guided the platform away from the ship by pushing against the hull, making just enough space to let Gabe's body pass as the platform came level. This meant that I was hands-on with the hull as his body rose up to head height. It felt like something out of a nightmare. Up close, I could now see details that had been invisible the night before. Cracked and frozen skin had turned a ghoulish shade of blue, and his open eyes bulged from these sockets like he was on the verge of popping like a balloon. But worst of all were the swollen, cracked lips that had been forced open by a glistening object the size of a fist. And tepidly, I reached out and took Gabe's head, pushing it upright as gently as I could, but still unable to prevent the frozen meat of his neck from cracking from the effort. It was a red sphere, a little polished orb of glass that had been stuffed into his mouth. It was the size of a large apple and was capped with a brass ring that had twine looped through it. Jesus Christ, it's a Christmas bauble. I cried aloud, speaking only to myself before looking up to see if anybody on deck had heard my outburst. When nobody appeared, I returned my attention to Gabe. Briefly, I tried to remove the bauble, if only to get a better look, but it had been jammed so violently into his mouth that it had dislocated his jaw and split the edges of his lips, revealing bloodless flesh, as blue as the ice that coated his exposed skin. I swore with disgust for a few seconds before I took my radio and considered letting Dan know, but what difference would it make? We could all go over the details later. For now, we had a job to do. Better to just get on with it, I figured. With gloved hands, I secured one of the loops around his shoulder, tightening it as best as I could without pulling on him too hard. God knows that I didn't want to separate him from that metal with his skin still welded to it. But despite being as gentle as I could, I still noticed the faint sound of frozen flesh cracking as I tugged the second strap tight on his right shoulder. "He's secure," I said at last. "Tell them to start heating up the hull."
"Will do,"
Dan replied. This, of course, was another part of the process that I had been dreading. It could take nearly an hour for the engineers to heat the hull up to the point where the ice had started melting. That left me dangling nearly 30 meters off the floor with no one but Gabe for company. To distract me, I tried facing the open Arctic, but that savage landscape filled me with an existential dread that frightened me in a different way. It was a painful reminder of how precarious our situation was. Sure, drones could ferry us supplies, and if the situation became truly dire, we could always flee to one of the rigs on foot. But that was still a 10-mile hike in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. I looked out towards the oil rig anyway, if only whatever minor comfort it might provide. From my position and with the sky clear, I knew that I should be able to at least glimpse the very top of it. And yet, even when I saw the very tip of its crenulations, I found no relief. I saw no smoke and no lights. That in itself was worrying, but not as worrying as the tiny bundle of color that I glimpsed about 4 miles out from our ship at the very limit of the horizon. I hadn't brought binoculars, so I couldn't say for sure, but I knew that there was only one thing that could left such an unnatural mark on the glistening white expanse that lay beyond me. "Dan," I radioed, "can you get somebody on comms? Now that the storm's clear, we need to reach the rig and make sure the evacuees were received safely."
"I already tried,"
he said.
"Got one of our engineers up there now. Told them to contact me if they had any luck."
"Have they?"
"Nothing yet. Any sign of that ice thawing?"
he asked. "Some," I said while looking back at Gabe with discomfort. Beads of sweat were slowly forming on the metal around him.
"We can try ourselves once you're back up. For now, you've got a heck of a wait ahead of you. Might as well buckle up."
I accepted this logic with a grunt and a grimace before turning back to the Arctic, where my eyes focused on that little patch of man-made color that I knew could only mean something very, very bad. Where the heck are they? Dan fell to his knees and tore into the snowdrift with both hands, slowly revealing a sled laden with supplies. We both had recognized it was from the convoy of evacuees, only it had clearly failed to reach its destination. Standing farther back, I counted the other lumps of snow, many with bits of plastic and metal poking out, and I realized that this abandoned collection of sleds represented almost all the gear the evacuees had taken with them. "They must have cut and run," I said. "Why would they do that?" Dan asked as he stood back up. "It's not even that far of a walk. and their pay would be docked for leaving all this stuff behind. The company specified this material was to be evacuated as well. I mean, come on, it's half the reason that they authorized the evacuation. They wanted their most expensive stuff flown to safety too. There's no way those guys would have left it because the walk got a little bit too hard. I mean, they didn't even try to salvage the important bits. Or even their own personal items. I had pointed to one sled whose cover had blown over, revealing a pile of rucksacks and suitcases. With a gloved hand, I grabbed a nearby pouch and found an old photo of one of these ship's navigators beside his wife. Dan, standing over my shoulder, observed with a groan of despair. "What the heck, man?" he cried. "This is messed up. Why would they do this? We've got to keep going to the rig and ask them. I mean, we're already halfway there. Crap, why haven't they come back for it?" I looked out towards the rig. It was closer now, but still no sign of life. No blinking lights, no distant smoke. Nothing. "Dan, I got a bad feeling about all this. We need to head back." "No, we need to go ask those idiots." "Dan, I don't think they left this stuff behind because of bad judgment." "What do you mean?" "They couldn't run," I said. "Something made them drop everything and run for their lives. It's the only explanation that makes any sense. And when you think about Gabe's body, I mean, what happened to it?" "Do you think we got a psychopath on our hands?" he asked. "I mean, I've been thinking the same, if I'm honest. What with Gabe's body and all the sneaking around, leaving stuff on people's beds?" "What do you mean?" "The little lumps of coal," he said. "Everybody got one. I figured it was a prank at first, but look, even if there was a lunatic on board, somebody who seemed normal but was secretly waiting for an opportunity to go all Michael Myers on us, an opportunity just like this one where help was too far to come. How the heck does one guy make nearly 100 people crap their pants and run off scared? And how the heck did they do that to Gabe? We need answers. We need to speak to the evacuees." "I got a bad feeling," I repeated as I scanned the ice and snow. "Maybe tomorrow. I'm not hiking any farther in this, not today. That storm could make a comeback at any time." Should we try and grab some of this stuff?" he asked while pointing to the abandoned convoy. "Some of the more sensitive equipment, maybe." "Tomorrow," I repeated while trying to hide my nerves. Out in the open, I was gripped by the inexplicable sensation of being watched. Let's just get back on that ship. "I think it's time to consider a mayday," Dan muttered as we both stood paralyzed with fear at the lower port. Neither of us could truly believe what we were seeing. Gabe's body had been returned to its previous spot, and now it had company. "It's everyone," Dan groaned. "Every one of them. I can see." I forced my eyes to wander over the naked bodies of my former crew. Men that I had seen just hours before, now frozen to the side of my ship like little baubles. Even from this far down, I could see clear signs of the damage. Unlike Gabe, they hadn't been dead long enough for their blood to coagulate. Their wounds had bled freely for at least a few minutes before the cold had sealed them, so that below many of the bodies were burgundy patches of ice as large as cars. Strange triangular stains that pointed to the grueling acts of cruelty that ended them. A snipped foot there, a missing arm there, a face caved in so badly that it looked like a half-eaten boiled egg. These bodies had been beat up, and even now some of their wounds still dripped onto the ice below. "It's not all of them," I said after a few minutes of inspecting the damage. "There's only 7. Someone must still be left on board." The canteen was a mess. Tables were overturned and dragged to the far wall, and red smeared the walls in strange, almost hypnotic patterns. Looking at it, I couldn't quite escape the notion that somebody had decorated the room with bits of people. What looked like intestines trimmed the windows and draped every flat surface, and shriveled bits of black and pink meat hung from light fixtures with old brass hooks. On one of the doors lay a wreath made of something that I couldn't entirely recognize, but which I felt no compulsion to investigate further. All I knew for sure was that there were enough fingers bound in its strange material to account for nearly a dozen people. And in the center of the room lay 3 boxes, plain packaged, wrapped in brownish paper and tied with a familiar waxy string. But unlike the packages with coal, these were far larger and they also had tags. Dan stood in the doorway, audibly gibbering as I approached the nearest box and inspected the little note. The letters seemed Germanic, and the handwriting oddly ancient in styling. I had no hope of translating it, but I did at least have the sense to take a picture with my phone, as a reference so I could recreate it here. "What the heck does that mean?" I muttered before pulling at the twine. The note made no sense, but it was clear this present, it had been left for us to find. "This is leather, or something like it," Dan said as he stood by my side and ran a palm over the paper the box had come wrapped in. "Ah, Jesus," he cried suddenly, jumping backwards, as if it had given him an electric shock. "What is it?" I asked. He jabbed nervously at the square foot of fabric that he had dropped on the floor. "It's got a tattoo," he groaned. I looked down and sure enough, the waxy beige paper had a faded, blue-ink tattoo of what looked like an anchor. "Someone's messing with us big time," Dan cried as he shuffled over to the door. It looked like he wanted to flee, but when he realized that I wasn't following, he couldn't bring himself to go running off alone. Instead, he waited nervously as I finished unwrapping the box. When I finally opened it, I felt an icy terror run down my back, like a trickle of cold water. "What is it?" he asked from the door. "It's a bauble," I said, "like the one that we found with Gabe, only much bigger." I lifted it up gingerly, gripping the thread with a gloved finger and thumb. This one was glass, much like the other, but 3 times the size. And its contents were not an opaque red. They were ivory with glimmers of pink and crimson. Teeth, hundreds of them. I uncapped the top and turning it upside down, I watched as they poured out like little pebbles onto the floor. Many of the roots still had bits of gum attached, and a few were shattered from the force of being removed. But what really terrified me was the sheer quantity. They couldn't have come from the men who had remained on the ship. There were too many. At a guess, it looked like 20, maybe 30 people's worth of teeth, slowly piling up on the floor. "Dan, I think it's time to send out a mayday and get the heck out of here." "Well, they found the radio," Dan said, his voice a flat monotone as we surveyed the damage to the helm, not to mention what was left of Alec. "Is that a Christmas tree?" I muttered, only just able to glimpse Dan's nodding head as he confirmed my suspicions. What remained of Alec had been destroyed beyond almost all recognition, barring his surprisingly intact head and the expression of agony painted across it. Otherwise, his body had been stripped and repurposed into a conical shape. His spine, fused with other bones, ran straight to the ground, and his skin had been removed and replaced into a strange new arrangement, such that it had bunched around his neck and spread outwards in a cone where it had reached the floor, and it was nailed down with black wooden pegs. It strongly resembled a wigwam, complete with a slit down the middle that revealed the contents within. "They made him into a tree," I muttered again, surveying the gut-wrenching arrangement of his ribs and limbs made to resemble stunted branches that helped prop up the tent. "What do you make of that?" Dan asked while gesturing to the large glass pane that made up the helm's view of the ship beyond. Normally, it would be clear, but right now it was covered in what looked like thousands of tiny handprints made of blood, and what might have been even crap. You might imagine the handprint of a child, by the way, but this was not the case. As small as these were, these hands had the slender proportions of an adult, just somehow shrunk down. The effect was bizarrely unsettling, the kind of thing that simply didn't look right. And yet, as horrifying as this sight was, it was the smashed and broken radio that truly threatened to send me spiraling into despair. Nothing remained. Even worse, all other spares on the ship had been gathered up, brought to this location, and pulverized into barely recognizable bits and pieces. I recognized the radio from my own office, and Dan's and even Gabe's. "I would say that's every last radio on this ship," I said. "Look," Dan said, gesturing to the two boxes at Alex's feet, or foot rather, as he now balanced on a single, vertiginous limb. I had to imagine those boxes were the unopened presents that we had left behind at the canteen. "Shall we open them?" "Screw that," I replied. "Let's get the heck out of here." You know, the more that I think of it, the more messed up the whole concept is, Dan said as we approached the abandoned convoy. "What concept?" "Just the elves in the workshop," he replied. "Elves?" I scoffed. "A little handprint?" He replied while waving his own palm at me. "And yeah, lumps of coal decorations. Freaking elves, man." It sounds stupid, but can you imagine being the first guy to describe a gorilla to someone? It's a weird world. Plenty of weird stuff in it. Why not elves? "So what?" I asked as we continued trudging through the snow. "We were naughty." "No, I think it's different," he said. "I mean, like I said, right, it's a messed up idea, isn't it? All those toys being made by elves, I mean, why? Who pays them? It can't be their natural environment." "Pays them?" I cried, and for a moment I couldn't help but laugh. "Yeah, who pays them?" he snapped. "Like what? They do it for the fun of it. I mean, come on, we've heard that one before, right? Forced labor, but don't worry, they actually like it. They like making free stuff for us to enjoy." "I just assumed it was a story," I said. "I think we got bits and pieces of something lost to history," he replied. "But whatever the real deal is, these things are upset and mean. I get the feeling that we're paying for sins that were made centuries ago. Feels like they hate us, doesn't it? I'm just saying, if you think about the stories that we've got, stories that were passed down, it makes sense why they feel that way. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not going to say there hasn't been something of a theme to what we've seen," I said. "But let's hold off before we start throwing words like elf around." Before I could finish my sentence, something caught my foot, and I went headfirst so hard that I practically disappeared into the snow. Thankfully, even as I fought against the suffocating weight that had enveloped me, Dan ran over and was digging me up before panic could really set in. That helped me get my bearings, and as I used both hands to push myself up, I realized at last what had tripped me. "Oh crap," I hissed. "It's..." For a moment my mind stalled as I tried to think of another way to describe what was laying at my feet. "There are presents," I finally said. Dan knelt down beside me and surveyed the two brown boxes. "I think we need to take the hint," I said. "I'm 99% sure these are the same ones in the canteen and the helm. The tags look identical." "Should we open them?" Dan asked. "I don't know," I said. "It's getting cold." Out of nowhere, a snowball pelted me in the face. It hurt like crazy, and I cried out before swearing violently. Ice had gotten right in my eye and something sharp had lashed my face. Looking down, I saw the remnants of the snowball, and I noticed glass shards glistening in its crumbled remains. Another one flew past and narrowly missed Dan's face. Looking around, neither of us could spot where they were coming from. but the snowdrifts were deep and only growing as the blizzard worked up to full strength. "Just take them with us," I cried, "and let's get to that rig." The elevator didn't respond to our call, so we were forced to climb the stairs, and it was no easy feat. It wasn't just that we were exhausted. It was the sheer weight of despair brought on by the realization that the oil rig was so clearly unpowered. Your average rig houses thousands of people, and it will often come close to being the largest man-made object that you'll ever see. But this one was silent like a haunted house. And the further that we went up the stairs, the more certain I became that we would find no one alive. Our evacuees never made it, and the men who awaited them had likely suffered the exact same fate. "Here we go," Dan said as we at last had reached the door. "That's not a good sign," he added as we both observed that it had been left open and snow had already begun to gather on the other side. We squeezed past anyway and surveyed the small room beyond. It was filled with coats and boots and other cold weather gear reserved for the workers who had the misfortune of having to go down the ice for whatever work it needed doing down there. All of it looked untouched, half frozen in the cold and slowly icing over. That door must have been left open for a long time. Beyond that, we found our first signs of a massacre. Streaks of red along the floor and walls, a lone shoe with a foot still inside, a scalp nailed to a door. The further we went, the more we saw of the crew and the damage done to the remains. Some of the rooms had been barricaded, we had noticed, and while most of the barricades had come tumbling down and their occupants dragged out, kicking and screaming from the looks of the bloody finger marks, only to end up destroyed by God knows where in the depths of the rig. Other barricades remained steadfast and intact. At these doors, Dan and I would stop and knock furiously, in the hope that at least a few people had survived and holed up in their rooms, but nobody ever replied. On the few occasions that these rooms had windows, we looked inside and only saw empty rooms filled with tins of food that no one ever got to eat. Clearly people had tried to plan for the long term, but what happened to them no one could say. "At least it's silent," Dan said as we had ventured deeper inside. "No footsteps." "Man, the heat is on," I added. Dan stopped and sniffed the air, his grimace showing that he clearly understood what I meant. The stench in the air spoke volumes about how many corpses must lay nearby. "Maybe who's ever hunting us abandoned this place," Dan said, but before I could reply, his words were proven drastically wrong. From deep within those haunting corridors came a keening wail that slowly drifted into what I could only describe as a sort of singing. The tune was alien to me, bordering on pure noise instead of music, but there was no denying that an underlying pattern invoked in me fear and unrest. It was music made for inhuman ears and maybe even inhuman minds. I was close to peeing myself when I realized that it was rapidly approaching our position. "Where's the radio room?" I asked Dan, who had experience of this particular rig in the past. "Crap," he hissed as he scanned the different hallways. "I think it's this way." Together, we took off down the hall that he singled out, and on more than one occasion we were sent nearly skidding to the floor as we ran across a slick layer of half-congealed blood, amongst other things. By the time that we had finally made it to the radio room, our clothes and hands were soaked in a foul-smelling liquid that looked nearly black in the low light, although I noticed with a hint of humor that neither of us had dropped our presents. "All right," Dan cried as we barged into the room, and he ran over ready to fiddle with the machinery. I slammed the door shut and locked it and turned around to see what might be the single greatest thing that I had ever laid eyes on. The radio was intact, and it was even blinking with lights. And to reinforce the good news, Dan began to cackle with hysterical joy. "Oh crap, they did it," he squealed. "They got an SOS out. It's been ringing for 2 days. Oh crap, Mike, they're on their way, man. They must be." I slid against the door and began to laugh and cry with relief. I had spent so long expecting the worst case scenario that this little bit of good news felt like it was at risk of making my heart explode. "Oh, thank God for that," I cried. "We can hole up in here and—" The singing returned, a distant howl that quickly ramped up. Before either of us had a chance to speak, it became a deafening cry and the door behind my back began to vibrate with the chorus of 1,000 alien voices. Dan looked at me with utter despair. "We're not going to make it," he said. "So close, maybe a day at most, but those things will never let us go. We should just open these presents and then sit back and wait." An idea struck me. I looked down at the box in my hand and realized that it might be our only hope. "Are you sure about this?" Dan whispered as he stood by the door. Much to our surprise, the singing had cut off suddenly, but the rapid pitter-patter of little feet just beyond told us that we were not alone, not yet. "You said it yourself," I said. "They hate us. Let's give them a reason not to." Together we opened the boxes that we had carried so far and emptied them, and stuffed whatever objects that we could find on hand. Shiny things, electronics, a radio handset, a phone, a watch. We piled as much as we could into the empty boxes, before wrapping them and tying the twine into delicate bows. "A gift exchange," Dan snorted as he gripped the door handle. "I'm gonna die over a gift exchange." "I just do it," I said. On the count of 3, open the door and push the boxes outside. "All right." He nodded and we both counted down in unison. 1, 2, 3. Dan ripped the door open and shoved the boxes outside, but before he could even extend his arm all the way, he was pulled so hard that his face had slammed into the steel. For the briefest of moments, he looked at me with terror in his eyes. I overcame my terror and began to run towards them, but it was already too late. A grotesque but tiny fist reached out, hooked a claw finger into his mouth, and it was soon joined by nearly 100 others that all gripped Dan's body and clothes wherever they could find purchase. The last thing that Dan said was a muffled bunch of words that I never managed to understand. And then with a single effort, our hunters dragged him beyond the threshold, and I reached the door in time to slam it shut and lock it tight once more. Help came in the end. I couldn't say how long I was in that room. It felt like weeks, but in truth it was probably no more than a day. But still, it dang near drove me insane. Not just the waiting, but the sounds of claws scratching at metal and strange symbols daubed on the glass outside. I slept whenever exhaustion took over my body, and each time I would await to find new decorations inside my room. Whatever those things were, it was clear that they could have killed me any time they wanted. I had to assume that my plan had worked, but all the same it was a poor consolation given the loss of my closest friend. Too little too late. When help finally arrived, it came in the form of some very stern-looking men in black military uniform, devoid of any signifying markers. Given the way they set about planting explosives while 2 of them manhandled me towards a chopper, I assumed they were going to fly me to some dingy little room and interrogate me. But they didn't. They dropped me on a civilian ship and left me to receive medical attention from some very confused-looking researchers. Of course, when I tried to tell them what I had seen and heard, it quickly became clear why my rescuers didn't think it was necessary to beat or threaten me into silence. No one believed me. I mean, why would they? My story was the rambling of a lunatic. The ship was sunk and I was blamed for sailing it right into an ice shelf, which technically wasn't incorrect. And the oil rig was lost to a nasty fire. At least that's what official reports had said. I never really moved on though, and even now this time of year threatens to overload my senses. It isn't just the constant reminder of the messed up things that I saw. It's the cards they keep sending me. Each one written in what I've since discovered was Anglo-Saxon, or Old English. They thank me for my gift, Not the box, you understand, but Dan. They thought that Dan was the gift. They took him gladly and spared me. I might find it possible to move past this, to live with the guilt even, if they weren't so insistent on including bits of him in the card. A finger, an ear, a tooth, his tongue. Fresh meat pinned to the raw-looking paper made from God knows what, and their notes scrawled in that bizarre Germanic tongue keep thanking me over and over. Thank you, good friend. They write me in the words that chill me to my core. Because it doesn't take a doctor to tell that even though it's been over a year since I last saw Dan, the bits of him they post have been freshly cut and taken from a man who must surely be alive. From the earliest age that I can recall, becoming a park ranger was my life goal. My father and I spent every free weekend hiking, fishing, and camping in Arlo Bennett National Forest. Not everyone is as lucky as we were to have access to 560,000 acres of pristine woodland, streams, and hiking trails, but with it being a 20-minute drive, we practically lived there from Friday afternoon to Sunday evening. While I could recount hundreds of stories of our exploits in the park, I think it would be best if I stick with the information pertinent to the dangers that I want to warn you of. When I was about 10 years old, my father and I had just finished setting up camp for the night. Our tent was placed, the latrine dug, and our campfire was burning warmly in front of us. After a heavy dinner and a canteen of water, the call of nature indicated that it was time to use the restroom. I wandered to the hole that we had dug away from camp and I relieved myself. As I was zipping my jeans there, a soft whistle coming was from the forest ahead of me. Looking over my shoulder, I could see my father, pipe in mouth, sitting on the ground by our fire. Turning back in the direction of the whistling, I squinted my eyes and peered into the distance to try and identify the source. It was likely a bird, I thought to myself, but there were hints of a subtle melody that kept me from being certain. The fading light of the sun didn't provide me with much of a view, so I continued listening to the soft whistling. Having decided that it warranted no further investigation, I resolved to return to the safety of my father's company and the now much desired illumination of our campfire. I turned around and began trudging through the undergrowth of the forest when, over my shoulder, I was certain that I had heard someone shout from a distance, "It's this way, come and see." My fight, flight, or freeze response immediately chose the worst of all the options as I stopped dead in my tracks. Turning around quickly, I looked in the distance and saw what I thought was the silhouette of someone far in the distance. One arm waved above their head as if to say hello. They didn't call out again, but it appeared a single arm continued to wave in above their head before they eventually dropped it and stepped backward, disappearing behind a monstrously large oak tree. Without another thought, I bolted the short distance back to our campsite and, in a panic, told my father what I thought I had seen and heard. He smiled and reassured me that it was likely nothing more than another camper, but he would investigate, shouldering the strap of his rifle and digging his flashlight out of his bag. We trekked into the woods in the direction I thought that I had seen the figure. My pulse thumped rapidly the farther from camp that we went. As we neared the massive oak that I had seen from the latrine, my father began to sweep the ground with the beam of the flashlight, searching for signs of a disturbance. There was no sign of recent activity. The dried leaves and fallen branches seemed to be completely undisturbed. We continued a quarter of a mile beyond the oak and still found no sign of another camp or any other human activity. My father ruffled my hair with his hand and assured me that it had just been my mind playing tricks on me. I wanted to believe him so badly, but something in my heart told me that I had seen someone, or more unsettling yet, something. After getting back to our camp and settling beside the dwindling embers of our fire, my father did something that he had never done before. He began telling me a ghost story. In this forest, he started, people for over a century had told each other tales of wanderers in the woods. Beautiful melodies whistled in through the trees. Strangers in the distance would wave and beckon travelers to come and see incredible things. Anyone foolish enough to follow them vanished, never to be seen again. Not understanding why he would tell me these things, I began to panic and tears pooled in the corners of my eyes. Seeing the visible comfort, my father smiled and told me that, as a boy, he had thought that he had seen the same things too. My grandfather had told him the same story when he was my age or perhaps a bit younger. Every time, they would tread the same trails that he and I hike now. He always imagined hearing or seeing the wanderers in the woods. When he told my grandfather what he had heard and seen, he took it as an opportunity to teach him that the whistling sound was a known call of a local bird. He would also find shapes in the distance and show him how inanimate objects at a distance could produce the illusion of a man or woman watching them. It could also be a practical joke, kiddo, he assured me. When an area has a popular urban legend, folks like to do what they can to stoke the fires. I began to calm down a bit. We were deep within a massive national forest and the odds of encountering another person were slim at best. My youthful fears had gathered natural occurrences around me and organized them into an unnerving and unlikely scenario. Even if it had been a person, I thought that he was right. They were trying to play a joke on us and I had fallen for it hook, line, and sinker. I used my posture substantially and smiled thankfully at my father. In all of our trips together after that, I never had the same experience again. That all changed when I began work as a park ranger at Fire Tower No. 1. Arlo Bennett National Forest was full of darkness that my father had worked so hard to convince me was only a figment of my imagination. I wish he had been right. I had just finished college with a degree in wildlife conservation not long before the start of the pandemic. Needless to say, this was not a kind time for new graduates. A local pizzeria near campus had provided me with steady hours and a decent paycheck throughout my studies. But with increasing recommendations and closures, my hours had dwindled to a quarter of what I had previously worked. Being hundreds of miles from home and the not-so-proud owner of a rapidly dwindling bank account, I spent hours each day filling out job applications, sending out resumes, and cold calling every national park and forest that I could find online. Desperation was mounting until I had finally resolved to pack up my belongings and move back to my hometown, tail between my legs. My parents had passed away in a car accident during my sophomore year. I wouldn't be returning to a stable support system, but I was at least confident that old friends and extended family may be able to help me find gainful employment. Steady footing just seemed so far out of reach. Moving day arrived and I finished boxing up the last of my possessions and stacking them haphazardly into the back of a rented box truck. After barely managing to get my beater of a car secured onto the tow dolly, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. Slumping down onto the tailgate of the box truck, I fished it out and saw a red notification bubble on my mail application and I clicked it. The feeling of joy I experienced can't be accurately described as I read the attached email. Arlo Bennett, National Forest Hiring Authority. Subject: Your application has been chosen for Fire Tower No. 1 in Arlo Bennett National Forest. Mr. Parker, congratulations and welcome to our team here at Arlo Bennett National Forest. We are excited to inform you that as a new park ranger for wildlife services, you will be stationed at Fire Tower No. 1. You are expected to arrive at Ranger Station 3 on, date redacted, at or before 8 a.m. EST. Uniforms, equipment, shelter, and necessities will be provided as This is a 24/7 live-in posting. If you require storage for personal items that you do not wish to keep in your on-site residence, accommodations will be made upon arrival. Please bring a valid driver's license, a social security card, and a copy of this email to be presented upon arrival. If you have any additional questions or concerns, please contact your HR representatives at 606-555-3241 during the hours of 8 a.m. and 5:30 p.m. We thank you for your time and look forward to meeting you. Welcome to the team. Dennis Garland, Superintendent 2, Arlo Bennett National Forest. After reading the email over and over no less than 10 times, tears began to run down my cheeks. I was mildly confused. The email seemed to be informing me that I had already received the job, but I hadn't even done a phone interview. I told myself that my resume and application must have been such high quality that it wasn't necessary. Hindsight is 2020. Only minutes ago, I was preparing to drive a box truck full of my second-hand furniture and meager possessions pointlessly toward my old hometown. Now I couldn't wait to travel down the road to my new career and what I thought would be a bright future. 2 days and one terrible roadside motel later, I pulled the box truck into a newly empty parking lot in front of a log-sided building with a sign reading, Ranger Station 3. 2 well-aged Jeeps sat parked side by side in front of the station, both marked clearly as Ranger Patrol vehicles. I couldn't help but smile. There I was, right where I had always wanted to be. With a mixed sensation of pride and terror, I made my way into the ranger station and introduced myself to a man with salt and pepper hair sitting at the desk in the entryway. I introduced myself and was greeted with a vice grip of a handshake, and he identified himself as Superintendent Garland. He explained to me that while he was generally not stationed at this location, he made it a goal to personally meet every newly hired ranger and walk them through the orientation process. Over the next few hours, we filled out a seemingly endless pile of paperwork, drank bad coffee out of chipped mugs, and I listened intently to Superintendent Garland as he explained my job duties at Fire Tower Number 1. None of the duties sounded unusual in any way to start. I would work in a 3x3 grid with fire towers 1 to 9. For the first 2 weeks of the month, I would man the tower from 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. A reserve staff member would report to the station to give you a day off to readjust your sleep schedule for the last half of the month. For the following 2 weeks, I would work from 5 p.m. to 5 a.m. Each tower in the grid was staggered by the shift to watch neighboring off-duty sectors around them as well as their own. The primary concern was to watch for the inception of forest fires. Lightning strikes and unauthorized campfires were a constant concern in this area, so around-the-clock surveillance was necessary. All fire tower rangers were provided with a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom cabin located at the base of the tower. They were fully furnished and basic sundries were provided for your first week on the job, with the expectation that you provide your own groceries and toiletries thereafter. Routine maintenance of the cabin and tower was to be performed by the occupying ranger. Mr. Garland also informed me that I would work 4 weeks on duty, with 1 full week off to follow. Reserve staff would report to the cabin at each tower to relieve the primary attendant to allow them some rest and relaxation. The second bedroom was to be reserved for them, and we were to keep it free of personal items. One exception to this rule was in the event a camper or hiker was retrieved during a search and rescue, until they could be evacuated to the nearest town by medical staff. As he wrapped up, I was smiling ear to ear. Dream job, check. Rent-free living, check. After a worrying season of my life, everything seemed to be going my way. I was already making a mental checklist of what personal items to keep in the cabin, and what I would need to store in the provided shed when Mr. Garland's gruff voice unexpectedly pulled me out of my daydream. "One more thing," he said, eyes locking with mine. "Don't travel any farther than a half a mile or so north of Tower 1. "Oh, sure thing," I replied. "No problem at all, but is there any particular reason?" Mr. Garland stared at me in silence for a moment, and I could tell that he was trying to sort out an answer. "Dangerous woods that way, son," he finally responded. "Bobcats and bears, a nasty business." I nodded politely, but it wasn't a terribly satisfying answer. My father and I had camped in that forest for years and had always known predatory wildlife lived throughout the entirety of the reserve area. Unless the bobcats had learned to ride the bears to hunt people down, it seemed unlikely to be any more dangerous than any other area. Regardless, it seemed like a poor plan to argue or question my new employer before my first shift even began. He shook my hand and gave me a few pointers as he walked me to the door. I picked up a duffel bag that they had prepared for me that was sitting in a chair by the door. Heading out to the box truck, I tried to reignite my excitement and invigoration for my new job. But the warning that Superintendent Garland had given me, it still circled inside my mind ominously. "Don't go north." At that moment, I fully intended to adhere to the direction. But soon my curiosity sent me barreling down a dangerous path. My first week at the cabin and tower was a whirlwind of information. The ranger currently occupying my new tower, Thomas Richardson, was a reserve ranger who filled in the off weeks of towers 1 to 3. As he helped me unload my box truck and unhook my car, I picked his brain for every piece of advice that I could think to ask. He had worked for the ranger service there for a little less than a decade. I was surprised to learn that he had originally been offered the permanent role in Fire Tower Number 1, a significant pay increase from reserve status, but he had declined. He said that he loved traveling to the different towers and changing the scenery that each one offered. He seemed like a very genuine and helpful man, but at the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder if whatever could be found north of the tower drove him to decline the position. "So, do you ever do any hiking or camping when you're off duty?" I asked on our last day together. "Yeah, at least once a month or so," Thomas replied. "I would say I probably hiked or explored everything within about 5 miles of the fire towers." That seemed like as good of a chance as any to naturally ask Thomas about the area north of the tower. I've got a pretty good grasp on the territory to the east, south, and west, but is there much worth checking out north of the tower? I looked intently in his direction, but he never returned my gaze. Thomas stood up quickly and began to pack his hiking bag without making eye contact. He tossed it over his shoulder and made his way to the door toward the wraparound stairs. Once he had made it outside, he turned and looked at me with a determined face. "North of the tower isn't safe, buddy." He turned and began to walk down the stairs toward his Jeep. "Bobcats and bears that way, stay clear." A few seconds later, I could hear the roar of his engine and the sound of gravel scattering beneath tires as his Jeep made its way down the road. I was surprised by his sudden departure and lack of a formal farewell. It wasn't as if I wouldn't see him again in 3 weeks when he returned to give me my days off, but for such a friendly guy it seemed like a rude exit. A bit of clarity from Thomas had been what I was expecting, but I was just left with a lead weight in my stomach and a slight feeling of dread. The answer had been so quick it seemed as though that he had practiced it, matched with the dash for the door. I was sure something worse than wildlife must be located somewhere in these woods. That evening, after my shift had ended, I radioed the 2 towers in my grid that would be assuming the night watch. Before departing the tower, we had to verify that they were safely on watch. After receiving an affirmative message from both, I began to shut down all of the tower equipment other than the radio and gather up my belongings. There was still a bit of daylight left, so I seized the opportunity to grab a few odds and ends from the storage shed to bring inside. I had mostly settled into the cabin, but there was still a barren bookshelf in the corner that was begging for some of my tattered paperbacks. I dumped the old cardboard box on the floor by the shelf and sat on the hardwood floor. Sitting cross-legged, I opened the box and began to scoop out the haphazardly stored novels and arrange them on the particle board shelf. The bottom was filled, and I was just beginning to load up the top shelf with the last of my New York Times bestsellers when I noticed something was sitting behind the lip of the bookshelf. I reached my hand into the corner and pulled out a worn leather book. There were no markings on the front or back to identify what it was or who it may have belonged to. Thumbing it open to a page marked with an attached leather bookmark, I could see the winding loops of cursive handwriting. Not a book, so to speak, but a journal. Must have belonged to a ranger who had manned the station before me. Momentarily, I considered reading it, but decided against it. Tossing it on top of the bookshelf, I made a mental note to give it to Mr. Garland the next time that I saw him. Maybe he could return it to the rightful owner. After stowing away my books, I took the cardboard box outside and started walking down the gravel path to the storage building. There was a steel cage to place garbage in an attempt to keep larger wildlife from rifling through the bins. I reached down to my hip to retrieve my jingling set of keys to unlock the disposal gate. Setting the box down, I slid the key into the lock and I opened the gate. As I reached down to retrieve the box, I could hear something off in the distance. By then, the light of day was a distant memory and my eyes had not yet adjusted to the darkness. Years of living in the city had made me forget just how dark the forest could be. I had still gone on the occasional hike or camping trip with classmates, but it had usually been a pay-to-stay campsite with bathroom shower combination and pathways lit up with soft wattage light bulbs. It hadn't occurred to me to switch on the light that extended to the storage shed. My visibility was aided only by the light of the cabin's front porch, which was swallowed up by the walls of darkness. That is when the whistling began. It was soft and indistinct, but I could hear it nonetheless. The crunching of leaves and the snapping of twigs in the distance accompanied the unidentifiable tune. I was unable to move as I attempted to locate the direction that it was coming from, but my efforts were fruitless. While the sound seemed to be coming from one point far off in the distance, I could also hear traces of it all around me. Before Thomas had left, we went over to the camping permit logs for our grid and there were none requested within 10 miles of my post. Although the most popular hiking trails were equally far away, so there was little to no reason for anyone to be traveling in that area at this time of night. The only trails nearby were less traveled and given to more experienced hikers. Anyone with the skill to travel those trails would also have the common sense to go and set up camp for the night. As I stood listening and squinting in the darkness, I couldn't help but feel like the 10-year-old boy from so many years ago, but this time I didn't have my father to comfort me. That night around the fire, he was able to explain all of this in a way that made me believe my imagination had just run away with me. Standing there by myself, I felt none of that certainty. The whistling grew louder and more distinct as I stood frozen in the darkness. Where before it was a disembodied and distant voice, I could tell that the source was moving in my direction. There was a haunting yet beautiful melody that I was able to hear more clearly. Crunching leaves and snapping twigs seemed to be just outside my field of vision. It was almost hypnotizing. My eyes began to close and relaxation began to settle into my bones. Icy fear had melted away, leaving me in a state of near bliss. I felt like it may be a good idea to just walk toward the source of the beautiful melody. "It's this way," I heard a soft voice say. "Come and see." The feeling of relaxation washed over me almost as quickly as it had begun. Where the melodic whistling had lulled me into a stupor, The sudden call from the darkness had sobered me to the situation. I stumbled backward toward the cabin and began to run toward the safety of the burning bulb. My heavy footfalls washed out all the noises from moments before. As I ran, I imagined some malevolent creature mere steps behind me, claws outstretched toward my back, still beckoning me to come and see whatever was in the darkness of the forest. Once I reached the front door, I pushed my way inside, slammed the door and engaged the deadbolt and slid onto the floor. My back against it, I simply sat panting and trying to listen for any signs of activity outside. There was no whistling, no footsteps on the walkway or the porch, no knocking. It was just the noise of my gulping breath and the thunder in my heart against my ribcage. After a few minutes, I was able to collect myself enough to put a plan together. If there was someone out there, maybe they were in danger. I went to the control room in the cabin and threw on the breakers to these spotlights, located around the perimeter of the cabin, fire tower, and storage building. Through the blinds of the cabin, I could see the piercing beams of artificial light. Before leaving the control room, I grabbed a floodlight and a hunting rifle from the rack. Slowly, I disengaged the deadbolt to the door and I stepped outside. The forest was now a terrifying combination of artificial light and obscenely long shadows cast by the spotlights. I made my way back down the gravel trail toward the storage building. The whistling had begun just beyond the storage shed. I turned on the handheld floodlight and began to sweep the tree line looking for anyone or anything that may have hung around. Nothing, not a single thing. For all of the crunching leaves and breaking branches that I heard, there was no sign that anything had moved through the area recently. Nothing larger than a squirrel at least. I continued sweeping the distance with the floodlight when I heard the ping of an incoming call on the fire tower watch radio. The sound made me jump and I dropped the light to the ground with a heavy thud. As my heart calmed, I scooped up the light and headed toward the tower. Already out of breath after running from the storage building, the ascent to the top of the tower was painfully slow. I finally reached the lookout box and I turned on the light.
Tower 1, this is Tower 5. Do you copy?
I punched the button on the radio mic. I read to Tower 5. Go for Tower 1.
Tower 1, status check.
The voice said.
I can see your spotlights over there, Tower 5. Everything okay?
I immediately felt embarrassed and didn't want to explain the commotion of the evening. Everything's all clear, I responded. Thomas explained how to use the spot system, but I wanted to give it a hands-on run. I'll cut him now. Again, everything is all clear. I thanked the ranger and headed down to the cabin and into the control room to cut the light system off. Hand trembling on the switch, I hesitated. As scared and tired as I had been, I knew that I had to take one last look outside before shutting off the lights. Pulling the cord on the blinds, I looked outside. In the distance at the edge of the spotlights, I thought I could see someone walking into the darkness of the woodline. My heart began to hammer again as I pulled my phone out of my pocket, trying to snap a picture, but they vanished before I had managed to open up the application. Before I returned my phone to my pocket, a curious thought had occurred to me. Thumbing through my applications, I finally found the one that I was looking for. A digital compass popped up on the screen and the needle bounced side to side as my hand shook. Once I was able to settle my nerves, the needle finally came to a rest. It pointed to the north. To say that I was on the edge for the next few days would have been an understatement. My night shift rotation was quickly approaching. While I hadn't seen or heard anything alarming since the night that Thomas had departed, I had also taken special care to avoid the opportunity. No more nighttime traveling out to the storage shed. No taking the trash out in the evening. If I needed to complete any outdoor tasks, I made sure to take care of them during sundown. I had mostly convinced myself that it was all in my imagination, but the thought still rolled around in the back of my head. Maybe I saw and heard exactly what I thought I had. Immediately after my shift each day, I shut down all lookout equipment except the radio and headed directly down to the cabin. My evenings consisted of a steady schedule of TV show binging, dinner, a shower, and reading in bed. The small supply of paperback books that I had bought didn't provide as much entertainment as I had hoped. Most of them I'd already read about a dozen times, and I quickly thumbed through the few that hadn't lost all of their appeal. The paperback that I was reading lost most of its luster, and I put it aside on the nightstand, and I gazed at the bookshelf to see if something else caught my eye. And that's when I saw that journal again. Shuffling out of bed into the bookshelf, I scooped up the journal and tucked myself back beneath my blanket. Initially, I told myself it was immoral to read somebody else's private journal. But still, the odd feeling that place gave me and the lack of other engaging activities made it easier than it should have to justify reading just a few pages. I flipped open the cover to the first page, and I ran my hand over the indentations of the cursive writing on the page. Although I had told myself that I would only read a few pages, that turned into about a quarter of the journal. The beginning introduced me to its writer, Gary Vincent, and his arrival in what would later be my cabin. Entry 1 was dated roughly 2 years before I had arrived, and told the uneventful story of his early life, education, and acceptance of the ranger position at Fire Tower 1 in Arlo Bennett National Forest. Our stories were fairly similar in many respects, but Gary seemed to have skipped the period of self-loathing and desperation before his employment there. While not the most energetic or entertaining read that I've ever come across, there was something enjoyable about learning the personal thoughts of who I assumed was my predecessor. Thomas had trained him as well, and the two of them seemed to have developed a good friendship, if Gary's words were to be believed. The two of them camped and hiked the area together and enjoyed their shared time at the cabin when Thomas came to relieve Gary for his days off. I was beginning to nod, in and out of alertness, having finished about a third of the journal, when an entry had jolted me back to attention. So, there seems to be something weird going on around here. I love everything about living and working in the forest, but now and again, I just get that feeling that something's watching me. I can't quite put my finger on what brings the sensation. It's the same feeling you get when somebody stands behind you in a room, but doesn't say anything. Just an electric charge, a sensation. Last night I was hauling the kitchen trash out to the good old dumpster dungeon when I heard someone whistling out in the woods. I always check the camping permits at the start and end of my shift, so if there's an emergency, I can get out and help them out. But the thing is, there are no permits out this far that we had on record today. I tried calling out to the person whistling, but they would just fall silent whenever I did. A few minutes later, this little tune would pick back up. I would try calling out again, but it was just the same. No more whistling for a minute. There was a time or two I thought someone was telling me to come and look at something, but I'm not sure. I headed into the control room and grabbed a flashlight to search the area, but after a half hour or so of stumbling around in the woods, I called it quits. I didn't see anyone or hear any more whistling. I haven't really been out here all that long, but maybe the lack of daily interaction with people is just making my mind act funny. I don't know, but I'm not too worried about it. If whistling is the worst thing that I hear, I think I'll be in pretty good shape. I read the passage over and over. The same thing had happened to Gary. The only noticeable difference was my total panic compared to Gary's cool and collected approach to investigating the area. I assumed that he hadn't experienced the same event as a child, but it was almost impossible to believe that this wouldn't have seemed kind of strange to him. A second difference also occurred to me. Gary hadn't seen anyone in the woodline. I wasn't positive that I saw a person, but I was certain that I had seen something. Too engaged with these similarities of the journal, I knew that I would be up for the rest of the night until I had finished it. I got out of bed again and headed into the kitchen to make myself a pot of coffee. After the ancient machine had spilled the last drop into the pot, I poured a mugful and settled into the kitchen table to continue my reading. The pages immediately following the whistling event were more of the same day in day out stream of thought entries that you would expect until about 3 months later. This place is starting to mess with my mind a little bit. I was outside last night doing my usual dumpster run when I started hearing that whistling again. Honestly, I had forgotten about the last time that it had happened until 10 or so last night. I tossed the trash in the cage when the whistling had started up. The flashlight was already in my pocket this time. I started carrying it a few weeks ago just as a precaution. It was louder this time and something about it just made me happy. Just felt like I could wander in that direction and hear it a little bit better if I could find who was making that beautiful noise. It kind of made me sad too though. I'm not sure why. I flipped on the flashlight and started walking north into the woods to see if I could find out who it was. I called out and asked who was there. This time someone shouted back, "It's this way, come and see." I asked them what it was but no one answered. When I started walking toward the sound of the voice, I could hear footsteps and the whistle moving away from me. So I called out again for them to wait. I just wanted to talk to them. They just repeated the same thing. "It's this way, come and see." By now I figured that there must be something to check out, so I kept walking after them. Maybe somebody was hurt. Probably not though. If they were hurt, why would they be whistling? My mind was kind of foggy and the melody made the traveling feel a little bit easier though. I felt kind of happy, like something good was going to happen. The woods were starting to get thicker and I wasn't gaining on them. They always seemed to be just the same distance in front of me as they had been the entire time. Occasionally I would catch a glimpse of someone in my flashlight beam, and I would call out, but still the same old thing. "It's this way, come and see." Eventually, I came to a cluster of oak trees that were so tightly packed together that they looked like one monstrous tree. When I got to it, the whistling stopped for a little while and suddenly I felt sad. My eyes teared up and I wasn't sure why. Then the whistling tune came back like it sensed that I needed it again to be happy. Sounded like it was up on the top of the trees. I tried shouting for them again a few times, but nobody answered at first. After a few minutes of trying to get their attention, I finally heard someone reply, "It's up here, come see." "Up where?" I asked the voice. "In the trees, just use the stairs," the voice called back. I ran the flashlight around the base of the trees and in the center. I could see what looked like a step. Inching closer and leaning between two of the oaks, I could see a spiral staircase running up the center of the trees and into the foliage. I started walking forward. The banister felt so smooth under my hand. I wanted to see where it went. For a moment, it felt like it was the right thing to do. Just grab onto the banister and climb up to the top. My foot was just settling onto the bottom step when a vibration startled me back to my senses. My smartwatch was beeping loudly, and when I looked down, I saw my heart rate was nearly 150 beats a minute. I saw the time too. It had only been 10 o'clock when I headed to take the trash out, but it was almost 11:30 now. Seemed like I had only been in the woods for maybe 15 minutes, but it had been an hour and a half. I panicked and headed back in the direction of the cabin. As I made my way back, there was the remnant of an old hiking trail that took me within a stone's throw of the cabin. It took me almost 2 hours to get back. My body aches and I feel like I have the flu. I'm not sure what the heck that was out there, but I'm going to have to call this in at the start of my shift. My heart raced and I continued reading the journal. In the next few pages, Gary recounted how he had called in the staircase to Superintendent Garland the next day. A team of rangers had met him at the cabin. They traveled back to the location where Gary had seen the stairs, but they couldn't find anything out of the ordinary. Gary begged them to go back at night, thinking maybe that they would see it again. The other rangers agreed in an effort to calm Gary's concerns, but the nighttime trip was no different. There was nothing there. The journal entries from that point became almost incoherent in their format. Gary was fixated on how the stairs had disappeared and why they couldn't find them. He admitted traveling back multiple times but never seeing them again. The absence of the whistling also seemed to bother him rather than soothe his worried mind. He wrote endlessly about missing the beautiful melody, and then it maddened him that he couldn't remember all of the notes. And then there was no entry for a long period. Weeks passed between. When Gary wrote what would be his final entry in the journal, he seemed to be a man who had lost a grip on reality. The music didn't return to me. I had been so sad without it. The gentle melody haunted my mind even though I couldn't quite remember how it sounded. So I traveled back again. Down the forgotten path, I traveled north. Traveled to that unusual corpse of trees. And there it was. The stairs were back, thank God. They were there, no one was whistling and no voice had invited me up, but I knew that I needed to go. I belonged there. With them and with him. He was waiting for me. The banister felt so good under my hand as I made my way up, into the foliage, through the branches, into my new home. Everyone is in unison there. The many are one. I came back here to say goodbye to someone. Was there someone here that I knew? I'll just say goodbye to you, journal. I'm going back. I know that I will stay. I want to be in unison. Maybe I can help others find their way there. I hope that you will let me help. So many souls can be won if they let themselves go. To anyone who reads these words, take heart. It is this way. Come and see. That was it. Nothing but blank pages followed. I was shaking as I closed the leather cover and stared into my empty coffee cup. The sun was creeping over the tops of the trees, and I knew that if I didn't move soon, I would be late for the start of my shift. I put on a fresh pot of coffee and began to ready myself in a daze. The journal stayed clutched in my hand as though if it were some talisman that may protect me from Gary's fate. I didn't know exactly what to do in the long run then, but I knew that I had to get to my post. Months had passed since I discovered the journal and spring was quickly approaching. I would periodically hear the whistling in the woods on evenings when I didn't have to work. The height of the fire tower probably just made it impossible for the melody to reach my ears when I worked nights, but I always assumed that it was there. When the whistling would begin in the evenings, I would put in a pair of earplugs to block it out. It seemed to keep me from feeling that unreasonable sensation to follow the haunting melody. Although it yielded no satisfying information, I shared the journal and its contents with Mr. Garland and Thomas. Mr. Garland explained that Gary Vincent had been a stellar employee for 2 years, but confided in me that he had a history of mental illness. While they explained his complicated situation, Thomas handed me a photo of Gary. He was a few years older than me with bright red hair and a huge smile. They told me that Gary suffered from something similar to schizophrenia. It had been well controlled with medication for quite some time. Once Gary went missing, Thomas and the other rangers found a month's worth of his medicine in the medicine cabinet of the cabin. He had taken to traveling into the northern forest more frequently in the last few months. Thomas Garland and a host of other rangers had traveled to the location with Gary, that he had claimed to have seen the stairs, and there was nothing unusual. Each unsuccessful search seemed to cause him to become a little more distant from them, until eventually they all quit talking unless it had to do with work. The two of them implored Gary to seek help, but he never did, and then he vanished into the woods. The subsequent search for him only turned up his tattered uniform and his wallet. For my part, I continued doing my job. I liked the night shift the best because there was no whistling. Staring out into the darkness for a few hours, looking for fire, soothed my worried mind. My phone ran a constant stream of music to keep me company. When I worked the day shift, I would bring Gary's journal with me and study, as though perhaps I would discover some secret to his madness. I never did. It just seemed to provide a madness of my own that I was obsessed with what had happened to him. I honestly can't tell you why I decided to do what I did next, but the mystery had become more than I could take. Thomas arrived to start my week of duty, and I told him that I planned to do some camping. He seemed excited to have the cabin to himself for a few days. The day before he arrived, I had already unloaded the ATV in the storage shed with camping gear and extra gas. I was going to go find that staircase. As soon as Thomas had started his shift, I fired up the ATV and headed on the trail to the east of the tower, so that he would be less likely to discover my plan. I drove the ATV in a wide arc around the Tower 1 sector, until I was about a quarter-mile due north of the tower. It took me a while, but after hours of searching, I found the rutted trail that Gary had written about in his journal. The trip was uneventful, and with the use of the ATV, I reached the tightly gathered copse of trees in no time. I slid off the ATV and approached the cluster of trees with caution. They formed a tight circle with a 3-foot gap facing toward the south. The canopy shadowed the interior, making it impossible to see what was inside. With a lump in my throat, I pulled the floodlight off the ATV, and I aimed it at the circle of trees. There was nothing inside other than fallen leaves and a few dry branches. My pulse relaxed and my body tension eased. The staircase wasn't there. I felt a mixture of joy and sadness. Gary had seemed so sure of what he had seen, and now I felt sure that he had been suffering from hallucinations. Thomas said that he hadn't taken it in months. A sorrowful picture of a man who had lost grip on reality filled my mind. Walking inside the copse, I couldn't find anything out of the ordinary. Feeling content that the staircase was only a fantasy, I decided to make the most of my days off and follow through with the camping trip. The day was warmer than the seasonal average, so I chose to forego the tent and camp out under the stars. I was only going to be staying overnight, so I opted to not dig a latrine, and I concentrated on setting up a comfortable fire after clearing the brush. Even with the unusually warm day, I still gathered an abundant amount of firewood, just in case it took a substantial dip in temperature. After a quick meal and a few chapters in one of my ragged paperback novels, I decided it was time to turn in for the night. I settled into my sleeping bag and enjoyed the heat from the stone-rimmed fire. It was only moments before I was fast asleep. Sometime during the night, I awoke to a familiar sound. The melody that I had avoided for so many months now was filling my ears, and it was coming from directly behind me. I rolled over and looked into the copse of trees. Standing in the gap between the oaks was Gary. I recognized his wide smile and fire-red hair from the photo that Thomas had shown me. Gnarled tufts of hair sprouted in random directions, and his tattered ranger's uniform hung off his emaciated frame. "Gary?" I asked in a daze. He just continued, giving me that unsettling smile, as he stepped backwards and was enveloped in the darkness of the circle of oak trees. I could hear what sounded like the thuds of hiking boots on wooden boards. Springing from my sleeping bag and grabbing the floodlight, I yelled Gary's name again. "It's up here, come see," he replied in a manic voice. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it into the trees, expecting to see him hunkered inside, but to my shock, the beam of my floodlight gleamed off a polished mahogany banister. There was a beautifully crafted circular staircase in the center of the trees. Lifting my floodlight, I caught the bottom of Gary's boot as he ascended the stairs. Shouting his name, I sprinted inside. "Gary, no!" I shrieked. My hand grabbed the smooth, cold wood as I began to climb the stairs in their tight circle. "Come back, man. We need to get you some help." I could only hear the thuds of his footfalls as he continued upward. My pulse was racing as I bounded up behind him, clinging tightly to the banister. Leaves and branches traced the side of my face as we both climbed higher into the trees. The beam of my floodlight bounced and weaved between smooth mahogany wood and dense foliage. As hard as I climbed the stairs, I could hear that Gary was getting farther ahead of me. My pace was beginning to slow, but I still clung to the banister, using it to pull myself up as I tried to reach the man racing ahead of me. The smoothness of the wood began to change under my hand as I climbed higher. What had been an unblemished surface began to feel bumpy and rigid on my palm. I was starting to breathe heavily through my mouth, and I knew that I would need to rest soon. In exhaustion, I decided to try to stop and catch my breath. The beam of my floodlight was pointed toward the stairs, but they looked different than they had when I first saw them. Where there had been a rich brown at the bottom, they now appeared the color of half-burnt charcoal. I traced the light up higher to get a better view of my surroundings, and I discovered why the banister felt so different. The smooth wood had transitioned into what looked like an unending spinal cord. The bones curled upward, wrapping around the charcoal steps like a pale snake. The foliage around me, which had been budding and green when I started my ascent, was now the sickly purple of a healing black eye with throbbing veins running through the leaves. Balls of black dew dotted the tops of the leaves. I noticed that anywhere this dew had made contact with my clothes, small holes appeared, and I could smell the light scent of chemical burn and hints of decay. The branches of the trees made sudden pattern changes from obsidian to ashen white. I began to scream and turned to go back down when I saw the section of steps below me crumble and fall away into nothingness. There was no way that I had climbed more than the equivalent of 6 flights of stairs, but I watched as chunks of the burnt charcoal platform and spinal cord banister drifted off into a purple chasm. As I tried to gain my composure and figure out what to do next, I could feel the step below me beginning to crack and sink. Without another thought, I began to run up the stairs as quickly as I could. All the while, I could hear the step just behind me crumble and drop off into the purple abyss below. There would be no more breaks to catch my breath. I couldn't even afford to glance backward unless I wanted to end up drifting off into whatever unknown abyss ran below. The air seemed to get thinner and had the tang of rotting meat. I could feel my legs buckling and struggling to keep up with the stairs, and I knew that I would soon fall back into what was below. Just as I felt the last of my strength gave away, my hand reached for another section of the spinal banister but found only empty air. My foot rose to find one more burnt charcoal step, but instead, it extended forward and found no purchase. I fell forward onto level ground. My floodlight flickered across the ground, revealing a gray and writhing field before me. It was damp and I could feel it pulse beneath my palms. I jumped up in a panic to get my hands off of the disgusting material. My hand shook violently as flecks of gray sludge flew wildly from my fingers. I was wiping the rest of the muck onto my pant legs when I lifted my eyes to the scene before me. The sky was a flowing haze of purple, full of a thick fog. There was no variation to this gray terrain. It writhed and shifted as far as I could see. Dotted over the landscape were thin, leafless trees swaying lazily in the cold wind. As my eyes focused in the low, unearthly light, I realized that they weren't trees at all. They were emaciated people. Thousands of them with bone-thin arms raised, reaching toward the sky. Some of their feet were held in place by skeletal hands emerging from the ground, while others seemed to be growing into a gray mass like a plant. Their eyes glowed softly with the same purple light as the sky. All at once, the numberless horde turned their heads towards me and spoke. "We are many, but we are one in him. Thousands of voices said in unison, "You have heard this beautiful song, and now you will sing it with us forever." A few yards in front of me stood Gary. The same sick purple glow flowed from his eyes, but he stood with his arms at his side. He motioned with both hands to a spot just beside him and smiled that unsettling smile. On the ground where he pointed were two writhing skeletal hands. "You've heard the song," he said in a dreamy voice. "This is where you belong, with us." I wanted to beg him to go back with me, to tell him that it wasn't too late, that we could help him if he would only let us. Staying there was madness. He had been twisted into something that he was. Before I could say anything, I started to feel that it wasn't as twisted as it had first seemed. The melody that I had heard so many times in the woods echoed everywhere now. The forest of skyward-reaching people produced an overpowering wave of sound, as they all whistled the same hauntingly beautiful melody. I started to walk toward Gary and thought that this all made sense. Everyone here looked so happy. The purple of this world was even beginning to become beautiful to me. I was nearly halfway to Gary when I halted for a moment and looked over my shoulder. There was an opening in the ground where the stairs had been. My head darted from side to side, and I could see more of these openings in the ground between these swaying forests of humans. There must be hundreds of these staircases leading up to this world. From my world, I realized, bringing people from our world to this brainwashing place. Looking back at Gary, I could see that same smile as before, but there was a nervousness to it. It was almost pleading with me to step aside and accept those skeletal hands and allow them to wrap around my ankles. But then I noticed the tears running down his face and the ever so subtle shaking of his head. He was trying to tell me no. Before I could ask him to tell me where we were, to ask what the heck was going on or what was happening there, I was startled by the deafening sound. It was almost like a foghorn, but so much deeper. My bones shook violently. The ground beneath me quaked, and the beautiful melody from the forest of people suddenly turned into a blood-curdling shriek. Their hands dropped from the sky and covered their ears, and I did the same. The second boom of the foghorn came, and the writhing forest lifted their heads, mouths opening until their jaws nearly unhinged. Thin streams of blue and yellow smoke drifted out of them, swirling together into a twisting cloud above our heads. It began to funnel into a stream and drifted into the distance. My eyes followed the tip of the swirling stream until I saw something moving far in the distance. It was mountainous, larger than anything that I had ever seen. The colossal silhouette was robed in fog, but I could still make out the shape. It towered above the field, blocking out the purple glow of the distant horizon. It seemed to sprout out of the ground into a thick torso with arms so thin that they seemed like they would snap if they were made to hold any weight. At the end of these bony arms, I could see clawed hands, scooping up people trapped in the gray ground in front of it. An oval-shaped mouth with two ivory protruding husks split open from its squat, stocky head. A cavernous mouth full of slender, sharp teeth gleamed in the sickening light. Two clawed hands shoved handfuls of screaming people into its mouth, in between long drinks from the blue and yellow smoke that drifted towards it. "They are blessed to become one with him," the forest of humans shrieked. "He will welcome you too. Come and see." The appearance of the eldritch horror was more than I could bear. I stumbled backward and fell to the ground as the gray mass writhed underneath my hands again. Using my feet, I pushed myself back toward the hole that I had emerged from and looked back at Gary. He was still crying, but he was nodding in agreement now as I got closer to the hole. I could see now that he was held in place by the same writhing hands that he was gesturing toward. Frozen in place, I thought for a moment that I would run to Gary and drag him with me. He must have seen it in my eyes. His smile faded as his brows furrowed and his lips pulled back in a pain-filled grimace. "Go!" he screamed, voice filled with agony. "It's too late for us. Go!" I broke my gaze with Gary and looked into the sky at the impossibly large abomination towering over the forest of tortured souls. Its massive hand broke through the fog and reached for me. Without another thought, I pushed myself back into the hole and closed my eyes. Floating in an endless void was better than allowing that ageless horror to consume me, or add me to its blasphemous garden of souls. The sensation of falling was terrifying and my stomach began to ball up tightly. I could feel myself moving faster and faster as the sickening purple void swirled around me. My eyes closed and I prayed that I would die soon to spare me from the nightmare. That is when I began to feel a sharp pain in my back as something began to strike me. I opened my eyes, but it was almost completely dark now. My body was slamming against solid objects, knocking the wind from my lungs. My descent began to slow and I could feel something soft and angular brush against my face as my body continued to be pummeled with blow after blow. My eyes were beginning to focus on the growing light and I could see that I was slamming into tree branches. Extending my arms, I was able to briefly grasp onto them to slow my fall. After what felt like hours, I landed with a sickening thud on the ground, and everything went black. When I came to, I was in front of the abnormal circle of trees. Dirt and saliva were caked to my face and my vision swam with ripples from the impact. I sucked in panicked breaths as I looked at these smooth mahogany stairs only a feet in front of me. My entire body ached, but I pushed myself up and staggered to the ATV to retrieve the gas can. Fuel spilled out of the upturned can as I dumped the contents at the foot of those stairs. I pulled a book of matches from my pocket and I flicked it into the trees. A rush of warmth hit me as the fire swallowed the stairs and the trees surrounding them. My vision began to swim again and I felt unconsciousness wash over me once again. I woke up in a hospital in my hometown. Thomas was asleep in an armchair beside my bed. He had awoke when I started shifting in the bed while attempting to make myself comfortable. My left arm was in a cast as well as my left leg. Reaching up to scratch my head, I could feel missing patches of hair. I was covered in bruises and cuts from head to toe. Thomas told me that they had found me after he spotted rising smoke from the lookout booth in Fire Tower Number 1. When the rangers and forestry services arrived, they found me at the foot of the blazing trees. I had been in the hospital for 3 days and had been in and out of consciousness. He asked me repeatedly what had happened, but I lied and told him that I wasn't sure. After Mr. Garland was informed that I was awake, he stopped by for a visit too. It was pretty similar to my visit with Thomas. He told me what had happened from his perspective and asked what had happened. I already practiced at lying about the whole ordeal. I told him that I didn't know. I had gone camping and woke up in the hospital. I wasn't fired from my job, but I never returned to Fire Tower Number 1. The Ranger Service investigated the fire, and while they were able to ascertain that it had been intentionally set, I wasn't suspected due to my battered state when they had discovered me. The last that I had spoken with him, Thomas told me that he had accepted the full-time position at Fire Tower Number 1, and I wished him good luck. As for me now, I've taken a traveling position with the National Forestry Service. I travel the country performing survey studies of the national forests under our care. It's been nice to see the country, and I still spend every available moment I have hiking and camping. My motivation is a bit different now. In every new town that I travel to, I always ask the locals if there are any local legends about whistling in the woods. I'm always looking for staircases in places that they should not be. I'll never forget what I saw in that purple-tinted place. What haunts me the most is remembering those hundreds of holes that I knew must lead to hundreds of different staircases. I always listen for whistling in the woods now, and I always carry an extra can of gas. Being assigned to Camp Pendleton was a dream come true. Located in Oceanside in northern San Diego, it's one of the biggest Marine Corps bases in the US. There's a ton of stuff to do nearby, whether it's going to the beach to surf, swim, or go for drinks at the pier. The people around here are mellow, and there's a surfer sort of vibe in the neighborhood. Everything was going great for me the first few weeks while I was here. But I noticed that despite the laid-back attitude of the surrounding area where I lived, my work life was rigid and inflexible. My commanding officer gruff and no-nonsense. I began to realize that this place was not going to be a cakewalk. And then one cool night, I woke up disoriented and far from my bed. Looking around, I saw that there was nothing nearby, not another person for miles. Just flat dirt ground with hills in the distance, and the black sky full of stars and a full moon above. I must have been sleepwalking, I thought to myself, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. I had been marching in my dreams while remembering my days of basic training, and I had somehow ended up in the middle of the dirt field. I looked around in every direction and finally saw lights in the distance behind me. At least I had an idea which way to go now. Turning around, I started to walk back towards the base, my legs wobbly from the long walk while asleep. It felt surreal to be out there in the middle of the night, and I didn't understand how it could have happened. I had been caught sleepwalking once or twice before, but I had never gone anywhere near this far. Part of me wondered with a paranoid fear just how often this happened without me realizing it. I walked for a few minutes alone, feeling an increasingly strange sensation like a tingling on the back of my neck. After a while, I began to suspect that it was that outdated, lizard brain notion that someone was following me. A remnant from some bygone era when humans actually had to worry about being stalked in the night. Just as I had thought that, someone cleared their throat in the darkness behind me. A chill ran up my spine and my flesh broke out in goose pimples as he spoke. His voice deep, gruff, and commanding. "What are you doing all the way out here so late at night?" he asked. I stepped closer, and in the moonlight, I could see him more clearly. My voice caught in my throat as I looked at his eyes and saw that they were yellow, like a cat or a wolf or a snake maybe. "Haven't you been told to stay in your bunk at this hour?" His tone was predatory and overwhelmingly creepy, but his demeanor was otherwise friendly. The part of my brain telling me to run was suddenly being hushed into submission by an unfamiliar voice which told me this was fine, and not to worry about a thing. "Look at his uniform," the voice said, and sure enough I looked down to see that he was wearing a Marine Corps uniform, with the insignia indicating that he was an officer. "You wouldn't want to disrespect a superior officer, would you?" the voice asked. "Sorry, sir, I must have been sleepwalking. I'm just heading back towards the base. I can make it home from there." He showed his teeth in a grin and told me that he would walk with me for a stretch. "We must be distant relatives from somewhere down the line," he said as we walked. "Both of us out here walking in the middle of the night. I wish I could chalk my trip up to somnambulism, but I'm just a run-of-the-mill insomniac. I can never get back to sleep once I'm up. I usually just go out for a long hike. It reminds me of the old days when I was deployed, I guess. Going for long marches that started before sunrise and didn't end until long past noon." The more time that went by, the more guilty I felt for having almost run from the man. He was just an ordinary guy, and the conversation became easier as we built up a rapport. and I told him about my life and my background, and where I was from. When I looked back at his face, I was shocked by what I saw. Maybe there really was a family connection between the two of us. In the increasing light from the base as we drew closer to it, I saw there was a striking resemblance between us. He didn't look like that when you first saw him. That suspicious voice in my mind said uneasily. His eyes were yellow, remember? And now look at them, they're brown. But it was quickly drowned out by that other louder voice, which spoke up and said all of this was okay too. It was just dark out in the dirt field, and I hadn't gotten a clear look at his face until now. Tell me more about your parents, he said. I want to know all about them. What are they like? I started speaking again, feeling hypnotized as I looked into the older man's swirling brown eyes. He was walking slower and slower, and I was matching his pace. The base was close now. I could see the lights of it were very bright up ahead, less than a couple of 100 yards away. But they were getting dimmer suddenly. The light was fading, but how? Were we walking backwards now? Was I even walking at all? Or was something dragging me now? It took me a few moments to shake the strange sleepwalker's haze from my vision, and I realized that I had been in a trance of sorts. When I looked at the man's face again through my half-closed eyes, I was astonished at what I saw. He didn't just bear a passing resemblance to me. He could have been my long-lost twin brother. His eyes were the same shade of brown, his hair close-cropped and chestnut. His jaw was defined and his nose was sharp and angular. But his smile and his teeth, those were not like mine at all. They were pointed and long, designed for tearing flesh from bone and ripping it to shreds. He was pulling me, dragging me across the dirt, deeper into the darkness again. "Who are you?" I heard myself asking, and in that second, he changed completely. It wasn't like what you see in a horror movie, like when a man turns into a werewolf over a matter of a few minutes. The metamorphosis was not slow and drawn out. Instead, it happened in a split second. I blinked and the man who looked like me was no longer there. In his place was an indescribable monster, tall with long limbs, pale gray skin, and pitch black eyes. Its jaw unhinged as it revealed teeth longer and sharper than those belonging to a wolf or a bear. It reminded me of that strange, ethereal white-masked creature from Spirited Away, full of hate and hunger and wanting to consume everything. It didn't appear solid. This thing looked like it was made out of shadows. A shot was fired suddenly, bringing me out of my hypnotized stupor. I realized that I was being dragged away from the base. The creature had my shoulder between its jaws, and it was biting down so hard that I could feel it grating against the bone. Another shot rang out, and I heard a few people yelling out. There were footsteps, and I heard something approaching from behind me. The thing tried to pick me up in its jaws, and it was so massive and so strong that it actually succeeded momentarily. I thrashed and I punched it in the face, kicking it in the eyes. My shoulder was on fire and my entire arm felt like it was dangling by a thread, as if it would pop off at any second, unhinging at the joint like a Thanksgiving turkey drumstick. And then for a second, I thought that it would. It popped out of the socket and it dislocated. The flesh began to rip and tear and bleed. The creature nearly tore my arm clean off as another shot rang out. I gave it one more good hard kick to the face and the already wounded monster dropped me to the ground, letting out a low moan of pain. It fell, its form turning into a large black puddle of darkness like an oil spill. before skittering off into the night like an infinitely long centipede. It blended in perfectly with the shadows, and it was gone a second later, just as a few other Marines arrived. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, helping me get back up to my feet. "Man, I never thought that I would live to see somebody get attacked by a mountain lion. You're lucky to be alive." It took me a few seconds to comprehend what he was saying. It was so bizarre. The thing which had just attacked me, it looked nothing like a mountain lion. It was long and tall and humanoid, with a black wispy shroud surrounding it like a living cloak. "Man, are you blind?" the other Marine asked. "That wasn't a mountain lion." I breathed a sigh of relief. Okay, I wasn't crazy. Someone else had seen the thing as well. It was a wolf. A big gray wolf. Man, I've never seen one so big. You sure are lucky to be alive though, that's for sure. Do you want us to call for an ambulance? I shook my head. No, I'll be fine. I can walk. I took a nervous look at them both, as if judging for myself again whether they were human or not. But I decided these two were the real McCoy. If not for them, I would have been that thing's dinner. The two of them walked me back towards the base, and I tried to decide whether I should tell them the truth of what I had really seen. But with each step that we took, the memories started seeming more and more surreal and dreamlike, to the point where I even started to convince myself that I had exaggerated what had happened. Maybe it was a mountain lion, or a gray wolf, far off from its pack, desperate for food. But no, the memories could have been wiped away, but the teeth marks were not. They were strange and totally unlike anything a wolf or a mountain lion might leave. When I went to the infirmary to get the bites looked at, they told me that they had never seen anything like them before. After several sets of blood cultures and antibiotics, they never did figure out what was wrong with me or how to get rid of my symptoms. Sleepwalking being primary among them. I would get up from my hospital bed in the night, and it would take a whole team of security guards to get me back into my room. So desperate I was to escape. Back to the fields, I told the man. I needed to get back to the dirt fields, to march. All they could do was watch, as my symptoms got worse and worse, and as black, vein-like formations began to spread from the bite wounds, like a dark plague spreading throughout my body. Everything is so cold now, and I feel like I'm losing control. I don't want to feel like this, but I can't help it. Whatever bit me, it infected me. Its contagion is spreading throughout my system, and I can no longer fight it off. I get these windows of time when I'm with it enough to speak and live my life, and then I get a period of darkness where I remember nothing. After a while, they finally discharged me from the hospital, leaving me alone to deal with the symptoms myself. I honestly think that they're worried about having me so close to the base. They don't know what I'm capable of anymore. Most nights, I wake up far from home, and I don't know how I ended up there. Just like that fateful night in the dirt field. It's like I'm sleepwalking all over again. Except that is not what this is. This is something so much worse. The dark veins are spreading up my neck towards my face, making me stand out and look oh so strange. People think that they're bizarre facial tattoos, inching their way up towards my skull. They keep asking me if I'm alright, as sweat pours down my reddened face and my eyes dart around with nervous paranoia. The blackouts are getting longer and closer together. I don't know how much longer I have left to be me, and I'm terrified of what's going to happen when those veins get to my heart and my mind. Who knows how long I have left before I'm out roaming the dirt fields, looking for a meal.